My sister fiancé stood under the crystal chandelier, raised his glass and pointed directly at me. "She is the family failure," he announced, his Rolex gleaming in the warm light. Everyone at the table laughed. Under the tablecloth, I tapped approve on my phone screen, finalizing the final wire transfer. The $2 billion acquisition of his company was done. I took a slow sip of my wine, waited for the room to quiet down, and stood up. "Since we are being honest tonight," I said, my voice carrying across the penthouse, "I should tell you who just bought your company." The room went dead silent. Before I explain how I used a corporate takeover to crush his arrogant world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing toxic people destroyed by their own greed. The engagement party took place on the rooftop of a 5-star Manhattan hotel. Julian stood at the head of a long mahogany table, holding court over the city elite. As the vice president of Aura Hospitality, he possessed a brilliant mind, an Ivy League education, and an ego that demanded constant validation. He wore a bespoke tuxedo and looked down at everyone who did not match his tax bracket. That included me. I sat near the end of the table, wearing a simple gray suit. My parents, Richard and Beverly, avoided looking in my direction, clearly embarrassed by my lack of designer labels. Julian leaned forward, swirling his champagne. He told the wealthy guests that every family has a weak link. He used me as the punchline, mocking my modest career and my refusal to play the high society game. Beside him, my sister Chloe laughed the loudest. She wore a custom silk gown and draped one arm over Julian's shoulder. She held up a sleek, heavy metal credit card for the guests to admire. "Julian takes care of everything," she boasted, her voice dripping with vanity. "He gave me this platinum black card. I do not even check the price tags or read the paperwork anymore. I just sign my name and get what I want." Her words hung in the air, a fragile boast built on a foundation of stolen money. I did not flush with anger. I did not defend myself. I picked up my silver knife and cut a piece of Wagyu beef, eating in silence. I waited for the laughter to fade into the background jazz music. Then I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and stood up. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room opened. Harrison, the current chief executive officer of Aura Hospitality, walked in. He did not look like a man in charge of a global hotel chain. His skin was pale and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He bypassed Julian, ignoring the outstretched hand of his vice president. Harrison walked directly to my end of the table. He bowed his head slightly and handed me a thick, leather-bound folder. Inside rested the finalized merger agreements, bearing the official red seal of the Federal Trade Commission. "I own Aura," I stated, placing the folder on the table. Julian dropped his crystal flute. The glass shattered against the marble floor, spilling expensive champagne across his polished shoes. The smug arrogance vanished from his features, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He stared at the corporate seal, unable to process the reality shifting beneath his feet. "I am not firing you, Julian." I continued, keeping my tone cold and clinical. "Firing you is too easy. Effective immediately, you are demoted to a junior auditor. You have exactly 48 hours to explain the $8 million discrepancy hidden in your recent offshore development ledgers. If those books are not balanced by Monday morning, I will personally hand your financial records over to the Securities and Exchange Commission." Julian fled the Manhattan penthouse before the catering staff could even sweep up the shattered glass from his broken champagne flute. The polished veneer of the Ivy League executive fractured under the weight of an impending federal audit. He knew my ultimatum was a ticking clock. He had exactly 48 hours before the $8 million void in his offshore development ledgers became public knowledge. Desperation strips away rational thought and forces a cornered man to seek the easiest available shelter. For Julian, that shelter was the sprawling colonial estate in Connecticut owned by my parents. Early the next morning, Julian parked his sports car in their circular driveway. He walked into their formal dining room, playing the role of a devastated victim. He possessed a masterful ability to manipulate the insecurities of wealthy people. He did not confess to the missing $8 million. Instead, he spun a calculated narrative designed to trigger my father's worst instincts. Julian claimed my sudden acquisition of Aura Hospitality was the result of illegal insider trading. He painted me as a jealous, bitter sister, attempting to frame him for corporate fraud just to ruin the upcoming high society wedding. My parents, Richard and Beverly, worshipped the illusion of their perfect family image. They swallowed his lies without requesting a single shred of proof. They needed a villain to explain the sudden friction, and they had always found it easy to cast me in that role. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new executive suite, overlooking the Manhattan skyline, when my phone vibrated on the glass desk. The caller identification displayed my father name. I tapped the speaker icon and continued reviewing a stack of quarterly earning reports. Richard did not offer a greeting. His voice erupted through the speaker, laced with venom and unearned authority. He ordered me to drop the investigation into Julian immediately. He accused me of engaging in illicit market manipulation and threatened to hire a team of lawyers to sue me for defamation. He screamed that I was a vindictive failure attempting to tear down my sister's happiness because I could not secure my own. He demanded I transfer my newly acquired shares into a family trust or face total estrangement. I listened to his tirade while tracing the edge of my mahogany desk. I felt zero anger. I only felt a cold clinical detachment. As his voice echoed in the quiet office, a vivid memory from 10 years ago surfaced in my mind. I was 22 years old, standing in a cramped, sterile bank manager office in downtown Boston. Chloe had maxed out her credit lines and needed $50,000 to fund a luxury semester abroad in Paris. Richard and Beverly were busy packing their vintage leather trunks for a month-long vacation in the Swiss Alps. They refused to liquidate any of their immediate assets to cover her debt. Instead, Richard drove me to the bank and placed a heavy predatory loan application on the desk. He forced me to co-sign the document, binding my early career to her reckless spending. When I hesitated warning him about the exorbitant interest rates, he shoved the silver pen into my hand. He told me to stop being selfish, sign the paper, and figure it out yourself. He walked out of the bank, leaving me shackled to a mountain of debt while they boarded a first-class flight to Europe. That memory forged the armor I wore today. It eradicated any lingering sense of familial obligation. I did not argue with the man screaming through the speakerphone. I simply ended the call, cutting his threats off in mid-sentence. I knew Julian was a dangerous adversary when backed into a corner. If he believed a federal indictment was imminent, he might panic and destroy the internal hard drives or flee the jurisdiction before I could secure the physical evidence of his embezzlement. I needed him complacent. I needed him to believe he was dealing with an amateur who lacked the technical sophistication to uncover his true crimes. I deployed a digital red herring. I called my chief information security officer into the office. I instructed him to create a synthetic audit trail within the Aura internal network. We bypassed the offshore development ledgers where the $8 million was hidden. Instead, we fabricated an investigation file focused on a separate minor discrepancy. We planted digital breadcrumbs pointing toward a padded corporate expense account totaling a mere $50,000. We left the security parameters on this fake file intentionally weak, ensuring Julian would discover it the moment he logged into the executive portal. The trap worked flawlessly. An hour later, my network monitors flagged an unauthorized access attempt from Julian remote credentials. He downloaded the synthetic audit file. Back in Connecticut, Julian read the fake investigation parameters on his laptop. The color returned to his face. The frantic panic evaporated, replaced by his signature toxic arrogance. He believed my grand corporate threat was nothing more than a petty dispute over mismanaged travel expenses. He laughed out loud, convinced I had entirely missed the massive $8 million offshore fraud. Feeling invincible again, he closed his laptop and pivoted from defense to offense. He decided it was time to strip the company away from me. Julian walked back into the study, where Richard was pacing nervously. Julian poured a glass of scotch and laid out a ruthless corporate strategy. He explained that although I held the majority stake of Aura Hospitality, there were enough floating shares in the open market to initiate a proxy war. He told Richard that if they could quietly purchase those remaining shares, they could rally the hostile board members, force an emergency shareholder vote, and legally oust me from the chairman's seat. It was a brilliant theoretical maneuver. But executing a hostile proxy battle required immediate liquid capital. It required cash they did not have on hand. Julian looked at my father and delivered his ultimate pitch. He convinced Richard to liquidate the entire family legacy. He advised my father to drain the $10 million generational trust fund built over 4 decades of conservative investments. Julian promised that this maneuver would save Chloe, future protect the family name, and humiliate me in front of the entire financial sector. Richard, blinded by his ego and his desperate need to protect his favorite daughter, agreed. He picked up his phone and authorized his wealth manager to liquidate the trust and transfer the entire $10 million into an escrow account managed by Julian. I sat in my dark server room, monitoring the banking compliance feeds linked to the Aura Executive Network. The red glowing numbers on my terminal updated in real time. I watched the $10 million wire transfer clear my father account. The wealth of my toxic family was now entirely in the hands of a cornered embezzler. But as I tracked the routing numbers, a cold realization settled over me. Julian was not buying floating shares on the open market. He was not initiating a proxy war or preparing to challenge my authority in a boardroom. He had no intention of saving my father or protecting my sister. The digital trail bypassed the New York Stock Exchange entirely. The $10 million bounced through a series of encrypted routing nodes, masking the origin point before landing in a black box account. I typed a rapid sequence of commands tracing the final destination. The money settled into an unregistered shell company located in the Cayman Islands. Julian was stealing my parents' life savings to fund his international escape. He planned to vanish into the Caribbean, leaving my family bankrupt and my sister waiting at an empty altar. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the offshore confirmation metric flash on the screen. He thought he had engineered the perfect disappearing act, but he failed to realize I already controlled the exit doors. I watched the $10 million wire transfer vanish into the Cayman Islands holding account and immediately locked my terminal. Julian had successfully drained my parents of their life savings to fund his international escape. But before he could board a flight and disappear into the Caribbean, I needed to sever his remaining access to the Aura hospitality infrastructure. A man backed into a corner with stolen money will try to pull every loose thread on his way out the door. I initiated a system-wide freeze on all executive asset transfers, preventing him from routing any internal corporate funds into his offshore shell companies. I picked up my phone and summoned the Aura Board of Directors for an emergency session. The primary boardroom occupied the top floor of the Manhattan headquarters. It was a cavernous space, defined by floor-to-ceiling glass panels, offering a dizzying view of the financial district. A long, polished mahogany table sat in the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The 12 board members arrived within the hour, their faces drawn tight with anxiety. They were seasoned venture capitalists and veteran hotel executives who despised sudden changes in leadership. They knew I had just purchased the company, but they did not yet understand my methods. They sat in nervous silence, waiting for the meeting to commence. Before I could address the room, the heavy glass doors swung open. Julian strolled into the boardroom. He did not look like a man preparing to flee a federal indictment. The panic he displayed at the engagement party was entirely gone. He had reviewed the synthetic audit file I planted in the network. Believing I was only investigating a minor $50,000 expense discrepancy, he felt a renewed sense of invincibility. He walked with the arrogant swagger of a predator who thought he had cornered a naive prey. Flanking him was a man wearing a sharp pinstripe suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. I recognized the man instantly as a high-priced corporate litigator, notorious for utilizing aggressive loophole tactics to extract hostile settlements. Julian took a seat at the opposite end of the mahogany table, crossing his legs and resting his hands on the polished wood. "I did not invite you to this session, Julian." I stated my voice, carrying a flat, unyielding tone. "You were demoted to a junior auditor. You no longer possess board clearance." Julian offered a patronizing smile. He leaned forward, projecting a manufactured confidence meant to sway the nervous board members sitting between us. He claimed he was here to save the company from an inexperienced heir playing a dangerous game. He told the directors that my sudden acquisition was a hostile vanity project, and that my attempt to demote him was not just a personal insult, but a catastrophic legal liability for the entire corporation. He gestured to his lawyer. The litigator opened his briefcase and extracted a single document printed on thick, watermarked paper. He slid the contract down the center of the mahogany table. It came to a stop just inches from my folded hands. Julian announced that former Chief Executive Officer Harrison had recognized his immense value to the Aura brand. He claimed that 6 months ago, Harrison had authorized a specialized executive retention contract to protect Julian from hostile management changes. "It is a severance clause," Julian explained, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "A highly specific golden parachute designed to trigger the moment my employment status is altered without gross proven misconduct. You demoted me publicly at a private event without presenting a single shred of actionable evidence. By doing so, you activated the penalty clause." I looked down at the document. The text outlined a brutal financial penalty. The clause dictated that upon unwarranted termination or demotion, the company was legally obligated to pay Julian an immediate severance fee of $50 million. The final page bore the digital signature of the former executive Harrison, along with the official corporate seal. The board members began to murmur among themselves. The venture capitalists exchanged worried glances. A sudden $50 million payout would severely impact the quarterly earnings and tank the stock price before the market even opened the next day. The litigator standing behind Julian cleared his throat, reminding the board that failure to honor the contract would result in an immediate lawsuit, tying up the company assets in litigation for years. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, savoring the fear rippling through the room. He believed he had constructed the perfect checkmate. He thought the fake expense audit gave him the high ground. He offered a venomous smile, proposing a generous settlement. Julian stated he would waive the $50 million penalty and drop the impending lawsuit under one specific condition. He demanded I transfer 51% of my newly acquired voting shares directly to his portfolio. He wanted to strip away my controlling interest, seize the throne of the hospitality empire, and reduce me to a silent minority partner in my own company. He sat there expecting me to panic. He expected me to consult a legal team or attempt to negotiate a lower buyout figure. I did not touch the paper. I did not raise my voice to argue the validity of the terms. I reached over to the control panel, integrated into the surface of the table, and tapped a sequence of keys. The lights in the boardroom dimmed automatically. A high-definition projector descended silently from the ceiling, casting a crisp, bright image onto the main viewing screen behind me. I opened the digital copy of his severance contract on the server. The document appeared on the wall-sized screen. "Corporate security architecture has evolved, Julian," I said, keeping my tone conversational but laced with a lethal edge. Aura Hospitality handles billions of dollars in international real estate acquisitions. The legal department does not rely on simple ink signatures or basic digital stamps. 2 years ago, the board approved a cryptographic security protocol for all executive-level documentation. I typed another command. The screen shifted, zooming in on the digital signature at the bottom of the projected contract. Every time an executive signs a binding document on the Aura network, the system embeds a layer of hidden metadata directly into the file. I explained, instructing the board to look at the screen. This metadata creates an immutable digital fingerprint. It records the exact time of execution, the physical device identity, and most importantly, the precise geographic location using satellite tracking and Internet Protocol registries. Julian's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward the illuminated screen. The litigator beside him stopped smirking, his posture stiffening as the technical jargon began to unravel their extortion attempt. I ran a decryption script on the signature block. The hidden data materialized on the screen in stark white text against a black background. You claim Harrison signed this golden parachute 6 months ago in his Manhattan office, I noted, reading the raw data aloud for the room. But the cryptographic hash tells a very different story. I pointed a laser indicator at the timestamp. The signature was not generated 6 months ago. The system registered the execution date as exactly 7 days prior. I moved the laser down to the location registry. The Internet Protocol address did not trace back to the New York headquarters or any registered corporate device. The coordinates mapped directly to a luxury beachfront resort located in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. The boardroom went dead silent. The board members stared at the screen, processing the undeniable digital evidence. 7 days ago, former CEO Harrison was attending a hospitality summit in London. I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. He was nowhere near Mexico. But you were Julian. 7 days ago, my sister Chloe hosted her lavish bachelorette party at that exact luxury resort in Cabo. You flew down for the weekend to celebrate. Julian gripped the armrests of his chair. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor in its wake. While you were lounging in a private cabana charging expensive champagne to my sister credit card, you accessed the company portal. I continued methodically dismantling his entire fabricated reality. You used stolen executive login credentials to mint a fake severance package, hoping to secure a $50 million safety net before the merger finalized. You typed the terms, inserted the digital signature, and sealed it yourself. The litigator realized his client had just dragged him into a severe federal crime. He slowly closed his leather briefcase, stepping away from Julian, attempting to create physical distance between himself and the impending disaster. You did not just forge a document in private. Julian, I concluded, resting my hands on the table. You brought a fraudulent contract into an official corporate board meeting. You attempted to extort 51% of this company equity using fabricated financial instruments. I looked directly into his eyes, watching the final remnants of his Ivy League superiority shatter into useless pieces. That is not a simple breach of contract, I informed him. That is felony forgery. That is attempted corporate extortion. And because you utilized the company digital network to transmit the forged document, you just committed federal wire fraud, right in front of 12 material witnesses. Julian opened his mouth, but his throat was entirely dry. He looked around the table, seeking a friendly face, but the venture capitalist stared back at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. He had walked into the room expecting to steal a hospitality empire. Instead, he had willingly locked himself inside a legal vault and handed me the key. The trap was sprung, but the cornered spy was about to seek a new hostage to leverage his survival. The corporate litigator packed his leather briefcase with hurried, frantic movements. He did not utter a single word to Julian. The high-priced lawyer simply walked out of the glass boardroom, abandoning his client to the federal consequences of his own hubris. Julian stood alone under the harsh fluorescent lights of the executive suite. The 12 board members stared at him with cold, calculating eyes, recognizing him not as a brilliant executive, but as a profound legal liability. Julian turned and walked out the heavy doors, his footsteps echoing down the polished marble corridor. He knew the traditional legal avenues were permanently closed to him. A forged digital signature, backed by undeniable geographic metadata, was a concrete trap. He could not fight me in a courtroom, and he had just lost the boardroom. Stripped of his corporate armor, he pivoted to the only battlefield where logic held no power and truth was irrelevant. He chose emotional terrorism. Julian knew exactly how to weaponize the fragile dynamics of my family. He drove his sports car straight back to the Manhattan penthouse and found my sister. Chloe built her entire existence around the addictive currency of digital validation. As a lifestyle influencer with millions of followers, her upcoming high society wedding was not just a romantic milestone. It was a meticulously planned monetization strategy. She had secured lucrative corporate sponsorships for her floral arrangements, exclusive magazine deals for her bridal gown, and branded content contracts for her honeymoon. Julian understood that threatening the wedding was the equivalent of threatening her financial survival. He fed her a calculated narrative, claiming I fabricated the forgery charges to sabotage her happiness out of pure spite. He convinced her that I was a jealous tyrant attempting to dismantle their pristine future. Then he handed her a loaded weapon. I was sitting in my executive suite reviewing the newly acquired corporate restructuring protocols when my private line rang. The caller identification displayed my sister name. I tapped the speaker icon, expecting a barrage of tears and empty threats from a spoiled bride. Instead, a sharp, hysterical shriek pierced the quiet atmosphere of my office. Chloe did not ask for my perspective or demand an explanation of the board meeting. She launched into a manic tirade, her voice cracking with unhinged desperation. She accused me of trying to steal her spotlight and humiliate her in front of the New York elite. When I remained silent, refusing to validate her hysteria, she deployed the weapon Julian had provided. Chloe informed me that she possessed a highly sensitive video file. She claimed the footage captured me standing in a hotel lobby, hurling vile racial slurs at a group of minority service employees. She described the video in graphic detail, detailing the horrific language and the aggressive posture. She vowed that if I did not publicly drop the forgery investigation and reinstate Julian as vice president, she would upload the file to all of her social media channels simultaneously. She threatened to forward the footage to every major financial news outlet and corporate watchdog firm on Wall Street. She knew a viral racism scandal would obliterate my reputation instantly. The ensuing public relations nightmare would trigger a mass shareholder sell-off, tanking the stock price of Aura Hospitality and forcing the board of directors to demand my immediate resignation. She thought she was holding a guillotine over my neck, ready to execute my career if I did not surrender. I knew the video was a fabrication. I do not raise my voice at staff, and I harbor no bigotry. Julian had commissioned a deepfake. Artificial intelligence manipulation had evolved into a terrifying weapon for corporate extortionists. By feeding hours of my public keynote speeches and board presentations into a machine learning algorithm, a skilled digital technician could map my facial expressions and synthesize my vocal cadence perfectly. They could make a digital puppet say anything they desired. Chloe was too blinded by her obsession with the wedding to realize she was handling illicit extortion material. She believed she was playing a masterful game of corporate chess, protecting her groom. I kept my breathing steady and my tone devoid of emotion. I told her that blind threats meant nothing without proof. I instructed her to send me the raw video file. A notification chimed on my computer monitor seconds later. An encrypted file dropped into my secure inbox. Chloe told me the clock was ticking, giving me exactly 1 hour to draft a public apology to Julian before she hit the upload button. Then she ended the call, leaving a heavy silence in my office. I did not open the video. I had no desire to watch a digital clone of myself spout manufactured hatred. I executed a secure file transfer routing the data packet directly to the subterranean level of the headquarters. My chief information security officer operated out of a restricted access bunker, managing the digital perimeter of our global hotel network. I picked up the phone and ordered him to run a forensic diagnostic on the incoming file. I needed to know exactly who synthesized the footage. The minutes ticked by in heavy silence. The New York traffic moved silently outside my soundproof windows. I poured a glass of sparkling water, analyzing Julian and his strategic pivot. If he paid a random dark web freelancer to render the deepfake tracing the origin would hit a dead end of bounced proxy servers. But Julian was an arrogant man. Arrogant men prefer to use tools they already control. They take shortcuts because they believe their intellect grants them immunity from detection. The secure line on my desk flashed. My security chief did not offer a formal greeting. He sounded breathless, indicating a rare break in his usual stoic demeanor. He informed me that the video was indeed a high-level algorithmic composite requiring immense processing power to render. But the creator made a fatal operational error. They forgot to scrub the rendering metadata before compressing the file for transfer. Every piece of sophisticated software leaves a digital footprint embedded in the code. The security team stripped away the visual layers, the synthesized audio tracks, and the fake background noise. They isolated the originating Internet Protocol address. My chief read the numbers aloud. He ran a routine tracer route, verifying the geographic location and corporate ownership of the source network. The origin point did not bounce to a cheap offshore server farm or an anonymous laptop in a local coffee shop. The deepfake was rendered, compiled, and exported from a heavily encrypted internal server rack located just 3 blocks away in the financial district. The Internet Protocol address belonged exclusively to Apex Group. Apex Group was the apex predator of the global hospitality market. They were our most vicious corporate rival. They had spent the last decade attempting to absorb our market share through ruthless price wars, predatory zoning disputes, and aggressive poaching of our top talent. The revelation struck me with the physical force of a tidal wave. The fragmented pieces of Julian and his erratic behavior suddenly aligned into a terrifying, coherent picture. Julian was not just a greedy executive padding his offshore accounts. The $8 million discrepancy in the development ledgers was not simple embezzlement. Julian was an active corporate spy. He had been systematically siphoning our confidential expansion plans, proprietary financial data, and internal guest registries. He was selling our corporate secrets directly to the chief executive officer of Apex Group. He used our biggest enemy to fund his bespoke tuxedos, his luxury sports cars, and his limitless platinum credit cards. The deepfake was not just a desperate ploy to save a high society wedding. It was a coordinated strike engineered by a rival conglomerate to decapitate the leadership of Aura Hospitality and pave the way for a hostile takeover. The battlefield had just expanded far beyond a family dispute. It was now a full-scale corporate war. The realization that Julian was an active corporate spy demanded an immediate shift in my tactical approach. I was no longer dealing with a simple, greedy relative trying to pad his offshore bank accounts. I was navigating a high-stakes financial war against the most ruthless hospitality conglomerate on the open market. Apex Group wanted to decapitate my leadership and orchestrate a hostile takeover. Julian was their internal weapon, stealing my data to pave their way. I needed to blind them both. I picked up my phone and dialed my sister. When Chloe answered the line, I did not project the cold, unyielding authority of a chief executive. I modulated my breathing to sound shallow and unsteady. I forced a slight tremor into my vocal cords, playing the role of a terrified and defeated sibling. I told Chloe that the pressure of the corporate world was too much for me to handle. I begged her not to release the fabricated deepfake video, claiming a public scandal of that magnitude would permanently ruin my life and shatter my mental health. I promised to drop the forgery charges against her groom and reinstate his executive access if she just kept the footage hidden. Chloe soaked up my manufactured defeat like a sponge. She laughed, a sharp, condescending sound that echoed through the receiver. She told me I was finally learning my proper place in the family hierarchy and that I should never have tried to challenge my betters. I knew Julian was sitting right next to her, listening to every word of my fake surrender. He would interpret my tears as his ultimate victory. He would feel completely untouchable. An invincible man never looks down to check for landmines, and I was about to place a massive explosive directly under his polished shoes. Early the next morning, I arrived at the Aura headquarters, hours before the sun broke over the Manhattan skyline. I did not go to my executive suite. I took the private elevator down to the subterranean level where my security chief operated the digital perimeter of our global hotel network. He met me in the server room holding a standard plastic flash drive. The casing was a bright cherry red. A plain white paper label was stuck to the side with the words Aura Expansion Plans, handwritten in blue ink. It looked like a carelessly misplaced treasure containing billions of dollars in real estate strategy. But the digital architecture, encoded inside that cheap plastic shell, was a masterpiece of modern cyber warfare. The drive contained no financial blueprints and no proprietary zoning permits. It held a localized military-grade ransomware payload specifically coded by my top engineers to bypass the proprietary firewalls utilized by Apex Group. I took the red drive, rode the elevator to the top floor, and walked into my pristine office. I placed the bait squarely in the center of my mahogany desk, ensuring the bright red plastic contrasted sharply against the dark wood. I instructed the security team to temporarily lift the access restrictions on Julian electronic keycard, granting him a narrow window of entry to the executive floor. I picked up my wool coat, walked out of the glass building, and crossed the street to a high-end coffee shop. I sat in a quiet corner booth, sipping a black espresso. I opened my encrypted tablet, tapping into the hidden surveillance cameras stationed inside my office. I watched the live feed in high definition. 20 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my suite clicked open. Julian stepped into the room. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, moving with a relaxed and confident stride. He believed my tearful phone call to Chloe the night before meant I was currently cowering in fear at home. He surveyed the empty office, his eyes scanning the minimalist furniture before locking onto the center of the desk. The red flash drive caught his attention immediately. Julian walked over and picked up the device. A smug, satisfied smile stretched across his face. He slipped the drive into the breast pocket of his suit, turned on his heel, and walked out of the office. Watching him through the screen, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The dramatic irony of the moment was thick enough to cut with a knife. He thought he was a brilliant corporate espionage agent, executing the heist of the century. He believed he was stealing the keys to my kingdom. He had no idea he was just an unwitting delivery boy carrying a digital plague directly to the front door of my enemy. Julian left the city limits, driving his expensive sports car to an exclusive private golf club located in the wealthy suburbs of Connecticut. The club was a designated sanctuary for billionaires, operating behind high stone walls and strict non-disclosure agreements. I tracked his vehicle using a microscopic GPS locator embedded in the plastic shell of the red drive. Julian walked into a private cigar lounge overlooking the manicured green of the 18th hole. The room smelled of aged leather and expensive tobacco. Waiting for him at a secluded corner table was the chief executive officer of Apex Group. The Apex CEO was a ruthless veteran of Wall Street, notorious for bleeding smaller hotel chains dry and liquidating their assets for sport. He sat in a heavy wingback chair, swirling a glass of neat scotch. Julian approached the table with the posture of a conquering hero, bringing the ultimate prize to his king. He reached into his suit pocket and produced the red drive. He placed it on the table between them, expecting a massive cash payout and a guaranteed senior position on the Apex board of directors. The two men shared a toast, clicking their crystal glasses together, celebrating what they believed was the imminent destruction of my hospitality empire. The Apex executive set his scotch down on a leather coaster and opened his encrypted laptop. The device was a secure administrative terminal hardwired into the primary cloud infrastructure of the Apex global network. He picked up the red drive and inserted it into the data port. He leaned closer to the screen, expecting to see my proprietary financial ledgers and confidential zoning maps. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and greed, they never ran a preliminary hardware scan. The moment the metal connectors touched the payload deployed, the script did not ask for administrative permission. It bypassed the Apex security protocols in a fraction of a second, functioning like an untraceable digital ghost. The screen of the laptop flickered once. The spreadsheet application failed to open. Instead, the monitor froze entirely, and a harsh crimson hue washed over the display. The localized ransomware acted as a highly aggressive digital contagion. It traveled through the secure uplink, infecting the Apex cloud server in real time. Back in their downtown headquarters, operations began to fail rapidly. Guest registries locked down. Payroll systems crashed. Electronic room keys across their flagship properties deactivated simultaneously, trapping guests outside their suites. The Apex CEO tapped his keyboard, his brow furrowing in confusion as his machine refused to respond to any commands. The crimson color on his screen deepened. A single line of crisp white text materialized in the center of the monitor. The message was not a standard ransom demand asking for untraceable cryptocurrency. It was a direct personal transmission from my desk. The text read, "I own both of you." The Apex CEO stared at the words as the blood drained from his face. The realization hit him with staggering force. He had not purchased my corporate secrets. He had just plugged a live grenade into the beating heart of his own billion-dollar infrastructure. The smug satisfaction evaporated from his features, replaced by a sudden, lethal rage. He looked up at Julian. Julian was still smiling, waiting for his compliment, oblivious to the catastrophic network failure unfolding on the screen. The Apex CEO did not speak a single word. He raised his hand, snapping his fingers in a sharp, commanding gesture. Two heavy-set private security contractors stepped out from the shadows of the cigar lounge. Before Julian could even register the shift in the atmosphere, the guards lunged forward. One contractor seized Julian by the shoulders, pinning his arms tightly to his sides. The other guard grabbed Julian by the throat, lifting him inches off the carpeted floor. The young spy choked his polished shoes, kicking the empty air as the Apex CEO stood up, his eyes burning with fury. Julian realized too late that he had not outsmarted anyone. He was now held hostage in a room with a ruthless billionaire whose entire empire was burning down because of his blind incompetence. The grip on Julian's throat tightened, cutting off his oxygen and lifting him higher off the carpeted floor of the private cigar lounge. He clawed at the thick fingers of the security contractor, but his polished nails found no purchase. The chief executive officer of Apex Group leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at the struggling corporate spy with eyes devoid of any human empathy. The billionaire explained the reality of the situation using a quiet, measured tone that chilled the air in the room. The money funding the Apex Global Network did not just come from traditional banking institutions. A significant portion of their operational capital flowed from shadow investors operating in regions of the world where legal disputes were settled with sudden permanent disappearances. By infecting the Apex servers, Julian had frozen billions of dollars in illicit international capital. The executive delivered his ultimatum. Julian had until midnight to force me to surrender the decryption keys and restore the network. If the servers remained locked past the deadline, the shadow investors would not file a lawsuit. They would simply erase Julian from existence. The contractor released his grip, dropping the young executive onto the floor. Julian gasped for air, rubbing his bruised neck. His pristine navy suit was rumpled, his silk tie skewed, and his Ivy League composure entirely fractured. He scrambled out of the golf club, driven by a primitive animal terror. He understood the lethal weight of the deadline. He could not reverse engineer a military-grade ransomware payload, and he could not hack into my secure server farm. He needed leverage. He needed to create a crisis so catastrophic that the Aura board of directors would panic, remove me from power, and hand him the decryption keys to save the hospitality empire from ruin. He decided to execute a high-stakes public sabotage. Tonight I was hosting the inaugural Chairman Gala at a prestigious ballroom in the heart of the financial district. The event was a meticulously curated networking reception intended to reassure Wall Street that the Aura transition of power was stable. The guest list included hedge fund managers, federal regulators, commercial banking tycoons, and influential industry journalists. Julian knew physical violence would only result in his immediate arrest. He needed to wage a white-collar war. He needed to destroy my corporate credibility in front of the exact people who controlled the global markets. Julian accessed a secure dark web portal from his vehicle and purchased a set of fabricated financial documents. The forged files were designed to look like leaked internal tax audits, proving that I had orchestrated a systemic tax evasion scheme during the corporate acquisition. If these documents were broadcast to a room full of federal regulators and market makers, the reaction would be instantaneous. Automated trading algorithms would detect the scandal and dump Aura stock within seconds. The Securities and Exchange Commission would be forced to issue an immediate freeze on all trading, and my tenure as chairman would end before the sun came up. To execute the broadcast, Julian needed internal access to the gala. He drove to a subterranean parking garage beneath a midtown commercial building. He paced between the concrete pillars, waiting in the dim fluorescent light. A rogue audiovisual technician contracted to manage the presentation screens for the gala stepped out of the shadows. Julian pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket. He handed over $50,000 in untraceable cash. He handed the technician a separate flash drive containing the fabricated tax documents. He instructed the man to hijack the primary video feed the moment I stepped up to the podium to deliver my keynote speech. The technician counted the crisp bills, nodded, and walked away. Julian leaned against his car, smiling in the dark. He believed he had just armed a digital bomb that would obliterate my career and save his life. He failed to realize that a predator operating in my territory never moves undetected. My corporate security perimeter extended far beyond network firewalls. It encompassed physical surveillance and human intelligence. My intelligence team had tracked Julian's erratic movements since he fled the golf club. We monitored his dark web transaction and intercepted his communications with the audiovisual contractor. 1 hour before the gala commenced, my head of security intercepted the rogue technician in the service hallway of the ballroom. We brought him into a soundproof staging room. I did not threaten the man with police involvement. I simply placed a sleek, titanium briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing $100,000 in banded currency. I offered double the bribe to flip his allegiance. The transaction took less than 60 seconds. The technician handed over Julian's fabricated flash drive and accepted my encrypted replacement. The chairman gala commenced with flawless elegance. The grand ballroom glowed under the warm light of tiered crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played soft classical arrangements in the corner. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. The room buzzed with the low, sophisticated murmur of the financial elite negotiating mergers and evaluating market trends. I stood near the front of the stage, wearing a tailored dark emerald evening gown, projecting calm, unyielding authority. Julian slipped through the rear service doors, blending into the shadows near the back exit. He kept his head down, avoiding the roaming event photographers. He checked his luxury wristwatch, watching the seconds tick closer to his midnight deadline. His breathing was shallow, and his palms were slick with nervous sweat. He stared at the stage, waiting for my destruction to unfold. The string quartet faded out. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as the event director announced my name. I climbed the carpeted steps and stood behind the sleek acrylic podium. The spotlight illuminated the stage, casting a sharp glow over the microphone. I looked out across the sea of wealthy investors and powerful regulators. I could see Julian standing by the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, a smug, expectant sneer forming on his face. I welcomed the guests, thanking them for their continued faith in Aura Hospitality. I spoke about transparency, integrity, and the unshakable foundation of modern corporate governance. As I uttered the word transparency, the towering high-definition presentation screens situated behind me began to flicker. Julian stood taller in the shadows, his heart pounding with dark anticipation. He waited for the forged tax audits to flash across the screens. He waited for the gasps of horror and the frantic phone calls to Wall Street trading desks. The screen stabilized, illuminating the grand ballroom with a stark, cold light. The image displayed was not a leaked financial document. It was high-definition security footage, captured in a dim, subterranean parking garage. The video feed was crystal clear. The integrated sound system of the ballroom amplified the audio, cutting through the silence of the crowd. Every hedge fund manager and federal regulator in the room watched Julian hand a thick manila envelope to the audiovisual technician. They heard his voice echo through the premium speakers, instructing the tech to broadcast fake tax documents to ruin my keynote speech. They heard him explicitly state his intention to manipulate the stock market and trigger a federal investigation based on forged evidence. The elite crowd froze. The silence in the ballroom became heavy, suffocating, and profound. Investors lowered their champagne flutes, staring at the screens in pure disgust. SEC regulators pulled out their encrypted phones, their eyes narrowing as they witnessed a textbook felony unfold on a 30-foot display. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice echoing over the stunned audience. Integrity is not just a corporate buzzword. I stated my tone, sharp and lethal. It is a filter that separates the visionaries from the parasites. You are currently watching former Vice President Julian, attempt to orchestrate a fraudulent market manipulation scheme to cover his own vast embezzlement. He thought he could weaponize your trust to save himself. Instead, he has provided federal authorities with an undeniable recorded confession. Every head in the grand ballroom turned toward the back exit. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the man standing in the shadows. Julian felt the collective weight of their stares, crushing the air from his lungs. The smug sneer vanished, replaced by the hollow terror of a man who realized he was entirely out of moves. His reputation was incinerated in front of the exact people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He was no longer an Ivy League prodigy or a rising corporate star. He was a documented criminal exposed on a giant screen for the entire financial sector to witness. The trap he built to destroy me had just snapped shut around his own neck. He knew the federal authorities in the room would be calling for his arrest within seconds. He also knew the shadow investors backing Apex Group were watching the clock tick closer to midnight. Hunted by the law and targeted by lethal corporate enemies, his mind shattered into pure panic. Julian spun around, shoved open the heavy oak doors, and bolted out of the ballroom, sprinting blindly into the cold Manhattan night. Julian burst through the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom and collided with the cold Manhattan night. The crisp autumn air hit his face, but it did nothing to cool the feverish panic burning in his chest. He did not look back. He sprinted down the concrete steps of the financial district venue, leaving behind the elite crowd, the SEC regulators, and the smoldering ruins of his corporate reputation. His bespoke tuxedo jacket flapped open in the wind. The polished leather shoes that had strutted into boardrooms just hours ago now slapped frantically against the pavement. He dodged a group of tourists and hailed a passing taxi, throwing himself into the back seat. He barked the address of his luxury apartment building with a raw, desperate edge that made the driver flinch. The ride uptown was a blur of neon lights and wailing sirens. Julian stared out the window, his mind racing through the catastrophic sequence of events. The corporate war was over. He had lost. The brilliant scheme to hijack Aura Hospitality and sell out to Apex Group had imploded on a 30-foot presentation screen. He knew the federal authorities attending the gala were already placing phone calls to secure arrest warrants. He also knew the shadow investors backing Apex were watching the clock, waiting for a decryption key he could never provide. The boardroom was dead to him. The high society wedding was a joke. His only remaining objective was basic, primal survival. He needed to flee the jurisdiction before the sun came up. He needed a private charter flight to a country lacking a federal extradition treaty. To buy that kind of ghost protocol, he required immediate liquid capital. He still controlled the escrow account, holding Richard's $10 million generational trust fund. That money was his single remaining lifeline. The taxi screeched to a halt outside his high-rise building. Julian shoved a crumpled $50 bill at the driver and ran through the glass lobby, ignoring the greeting from the night concierge. He rode the private elevator to his penthouse, his leg bouncing with nervous kinetic energy. He stepped into his apartment, locking the heavy steel deadbolt behind him. The space was a monument to his vanity, featuring imported Italian marble floors, abstract art, and panoramic views of the city skyline. None of it mattered now. He bypassed the wet bar and went straight for the hidden floor safe in his study. Julian retrieved a sleek, titanium laptop. This device was not connected to the corporate servers. It utilized a dedicated encrypted network designed specifically for offshore banking maneuvers. He placed the laptop on his glass desk and powered it up. His hands shook with untamed adrenaline. The fear coursing through his veins made his fingers clumsy. He miskeyed his own alphanumeric password twice before finally breaching the home screen. He navigated to the secure portal of the escrow firm currently holding my father life savings. The balance displayed in bold green numerals confirmed the $10 million sat ready for deployment. Julian opened a second tab accessing the routing interface for his unregistered shell company in the Cayman Islands. He had set up this phantom entity months ago as a contingency plan. It was a digital ghost designed to swallow funds and scatter them across a dozen untraceable offshore ledgers. He copied the complex routing numbers into the transfer fields. He typed out the full $10 million sum, leaving nothing behind. He prepared to drain my family dry and vanish into the Caribbean. He took a deep breath, steadying his trembling index finger over the trackpad. While Julian prepared to steal a fortune, I was standing in a quiet, soundproof staging room located just behind the main ballroom stage. The gala raged on outside the doors. The wealthy investors were still whispering frantically about the exposed sabotage. I did not stay to bask in the applause or answer questions from the financial press. I had a predator to finish off. My chief legal counsel and my head of security waited for me in the staging room. I handed them my encrypted tablet. We were not calling the local police to report a simple theft. We were initiating a preemptive federal strike. I knew Julian would run. A man facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary and lethal threats from shadow investors does not stick around to hire a defense attorney. I knew he controlled the escrow account holding Richard liquidated trust. I understood the precise mechanics of white-collar flight. Using my executive clearance, I accessed the secure communication channel dedicated to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FinCEN operates as the primary financial intelligence unit for the federal government monitoring illicit capital flows. You cannot simply call them and ask for a favor. You must provide concrete, actionable intelligence. I uploaded a comprehensive data packet. The submission included the metadata, proving Julian forged the $50 million golden parachute. It contained the network logs tracing the Deepfake extortion video back to the Apex Group servers. Finally, I attached the high-definition security footage of Julian bribing the audiovisual technician to manipulate the stock market. I categorized the submission under a priority suspicious activity report, flagging Julian as an immediate flight risk, attempting international money laundering. The federal algorithms prioritize reports submitted by chief executives of billion-dollar conglomerates, especially when accompanied by undeniable cryptographic evidence. The Patriot Act contains specific provisions designed to halt the rapid movement of uncollateralized funds across international borders. When the system detects a flagged individual attempting to move staggering amounts of wealth to a known tax haven, the response is automated, instantaneous, and ruthless. Julian sat in his dark study, bathed in the cool blue light of his laptop screen. He hovered his cursor over the execute button. He pictured the warm beaches of the Cayman Islands. He imagined the anonymous luxury he would purchase with my father, stolen legacy. He clicked the trackpad. A loading icon appeared spinning slowly in the center of the screen. Establishing secure connection. Verifying routing parameters. Julian held his breath. The spinning circle felt like it lasted an eternity. He gripped the edge of his glass desk, his knuckles turning white. The loading icon vanished. The screen did not display a green confirmation receipt. Instead, the display flashed a harsh, blinding crimson. A generic error tone chimed from the laptop speakers. Julian blinked, leaning closer to the monitor. A thick, black text box materialized over the red background. The message stated that the transaction was denied. Julian let out a ragged breath. He cursed, slamming his fist against the desk. He assumed he had typed a digit wrong. He refreshed the portal, preparing to enter the routing numbers a second time. The login page refused to load. The banking interface dissolved, replaced by a stark white page bearing the official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. The text below the seal was cold and bureaucratic. It informed the user that all assets associated with this financial profile were currently subject to a federal freeze under Title III of the USA Patriot Act. The uncollateralized international wire transfer attempt had triggered an automated anti-money laundering protocol. The funds were locked pending a comprehensive criminal investigation. Julian stared at the seal, his mind struggling to process the visual information. The $10 million was gone. It was not in the Cayman Islands, and it was no longer accessible in New York. The federal government had swallowed the escrow account whole. Panic mutated into pure, chaotic terror. Julian abandoned the encrypted laptop and pulled out his personal smartphone. He opened his primary checking account application. Error code. Federal hold. He logged into his premium brokerage account, hoping to liquidate a few blue-chip stocks to buy a commercial plane ticket. Error code. Federal hold. He even accessed the portal for the platinum credit card he had gifted to Chloe just weeks prior. The balance read 0 available credit. The trap I engineered was flawless. By initiating the offshore wire transfer, Julian had handed the federal algorithms the exact justification they needed to execute a blanket freeze. The system did not just lock the stolen trust fund. It traced his social security number and locked every single financial instrument attached to his identity. Julian dropped his phone. The device clattered against the imported marble floor. He fell back into his leather desk chair, staring at the dark Manhattan skyline outside his window. The reality of his situation crushed the remaining air from his lungs. He was a man accustomed to limitless wealth and boundless privilege. Now he did not have enough liquid capital to buy a cup of coffee. He could not hire a defense attorney. He could not bribe a pilot. He was trapped in the most expensive city in the world, hunted by federal agents and marked for death by a hostile billionaire. He had 0 cash, 0 credit, and 0 allies. The pristine silence of his luxury penthouse felt like a tomb. Driven by the agonizing realization that his brilliant mind had engineered his own total destruction, Julian looked toward the door. Logic and reason were dead. The only path forward was an act of pure reckless desperation. He needed leverage to force my hand, and he knew exactly where to find me. The corporate spy prepared to execute a final physical strike against the woman who had just erased his existence. It was past 2 in the morning when the shadow detached itself from the corridor and fell across the frosted glass doors of my executive suite. The global headquarters operated on a skeleton crew of overnight security personnel. Julian knew their patrol routes. He had spent years walking these polished floors as a senior vice president. He knew that the biometric scanners on the service elevators underwent a routine software update at 2:15 every morning, creating a narrow 90-second window where a manual override code could bypass the security grid. He retained that specific maintenance code from a fire drill audit conducted last year. The heavy glass doors clicked unlocked, and he stepped into my office. The city lights of the Manhattan skyline filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the modern furniture. I was not startled by the intrusion. I was waiting for him. I sat behind my mahogany desk, the soft glow of a brass reading lamp illuminating a stack of restructuring reports. A fresh cup of dark espresso rested near my fingertips. Julian did not carry a firearm. A man educated in the Ivy League views physical confrontation as a crude tactic reserved for the lower classes. He brought a weapon forged entirely from corporate bureaucracy. He approached my desk and dropped a thick leather-bound binder onto the glass surface. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. His appearance was a stark departure from the flawless executive I had encountered at the engagement party. His bespoke navy suit was severely wrinkled. His silk tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar, and dark hollow circles bruised the skin under his bloodshot eyes. He looked like a hunted animal draped in ruined couture. He leaned over the desk, planting his palms flat on the cold glass. He stared at me with a manic, desperate intensity. He told me the corporate war was not finished. Julian flipped open the heavy binder. The rings clicked loudly, exposing hundreds of pages of municipal code printed on yellowing archival paper. He explained his strategy with rapid, breathless articulation. Aura Hospitality operated 4 flagship luxury properties in the heart of New York and Chicago. Those specific high-rise hotels generated 40% of the annual revenue for the entire global brand. Julian spent the last 3 hours scouring the dark restricted archives of the corporate intranet. He uncovered a severe regulatory loophole. The land beneath those flagship hotels was developed utilizing conditional zoning permits established in the 1970s. The original permits contained an obscure mandate requiring specific structural reinforcements that the company had silently bypassed during recent modern renovations. Julian stated that as a former senior executive, he possessed the legal standing to file a whistleblower injunction with the Municipal Planning Commission. He threatened to submit the contents of the binder to the city inspectors the moment government offices opened in the morning. If the commission received this documented proof, they would be legally obligated to issue immediate stop work orders. Operating licenses for the flagship properties would be suspended. The hotels would be forced to shut their doors to all paying guests, triggering a catastrophic loss in daily revenue. The ensuing legal battle with the city would plunge the properties into a decade of costly litigation, effectively bankrupting the core of my new empire. He demanded a trade. He wanted his life back. Julian ordered me to pick up my phone and contact the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He wanted me to retract the suspicious activity report and lift the freeze on his escrow accounts. He demanded that the $10 million stolen from my family trust be released and allowed to clear the offshore routing nodes in the Cayman Islands. He wanted a clean exit from the country and a guarantee that Aura Hospitality would not pursue criminal charges. He promised that if I facilitated his escape, he would leave the binder on my desk and walk away. When I did not immediately reach for my phone, the desperation in his voice began to curdle. The frantic terror of the cornered man morphed back into his signature toxic arrogance. He mistook my silence for submission. Believing his zoning threat was an uncrackable legal checkmate, he straightened his posture and began to gloat. He paced the length of my office, his leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He insulted my intellect, mocking my plain suits, and my refusal to assimilate into the high society culture he worshipped. He bragged about the sheer ease with which he manipulated my entire family. He did not just boast in vague terms. He delivered a detailed verbal autopsy of his own criminal enterprise. He mocked my father, calling Richard a gullible fool for liquidating a $10 million generational trust based on a few whispered lies in a dining room. He laughed at my sister, dismissing Chloe as a vain, empty vessel who eagerly signed offshore tax evasion documents just to fund her bridal wardrobe. He detailed the exact accounting maneuvers he engineered to hide the $8 million in the offshore development ledgers, using phantom shell companies to wash the funds. He even recounted the forgery, boasting about how he cracked the executive security portal from a poolside cabana in Mexico to mint the fake $50 million severance contract. He laid out every single piece of his fraud, wearing his felonies like a badge of honor. He thought he was giving a victory speech to a defeated rival. I did not interrupt him. I allowed the silence to stretch, absorbing his insults and his grand confessions without a single shift in my posture. I picked up my porcelain cup and took a slow, measured sip of the dark espresso. The bitter liquid grounded me in the present reality. I set the cup down carefully, ensuring it made no sound against the saucer. I looked up at the young executive standing in front of my desk and offered him a cold, precise smile. I told him his legal theory regarding the archaic zoning permits was brilliant. Then I reached under the edge of my mahogany desk and pressed a recessed silver button. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards of the executive suite. The heavy mahogany doors leading to my adjoining private conference room slid apart on their hidden electronic tracks. Julian stopped pacing. His arrogant smile froze. 3 individuals stepped out of the dark conference room and into the warm light of my office. They did not wear the tailored suits of Wall Street investors. They wore crisp, functional gray suits, displaying the official silver badges of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division clipped to their belts. Leading them was a senior federal inspector holding a digital audio recorder with a blinking red light. My office was not just a workspace. It was a secure containment zone. Prior to Julian arriving, I had authorized the federal agents to install a direct encrypted audio feed linking my desk to their mobile command unit. Julian had just spent the last 10 minutes delivering a comprehensive, uncoerced verbal confession to a room full of federal law enforcement officers. He had explicitly outlined his embezzlement, his wire fraud, his money laundering tactics, and his manipulation of offshore shell companies. The senior inspector stepped forward, placing a hand on the leather binder resting on my desk. He looked at Julian with the clinical detachment of a man who hunted financial predators for a living. The inspector stated that while the zoning laws were an interesting piece of municipal trivia, they would not protect him from federal tax evasion and corporate espionage. The trap snapped shut, sealing the brilliant executive inside a concrete legal vault engineered by his own unchecked vocal pride. The metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed sharply across the quiet executive suite. The senior inspector from the Internal Revenue Service read the Miranda rights with a flat, bureaucratic drone that offered zero room for negotiation. Julian stood frozen, his wrists bound tightly behind his back. The arrogance that defined his entire existence dissolved into a hollow, terrified stare. He looked at me one final time, searching for a sliver of mercy, but he found only cold, calculating indifference. The federal agents escorted the ruined executive out of my office, guiding him toward the service elevators and awaiting armored transport. The heavy glass doors slid shut, restoring the pristine silence of my workspace. The corporate spy was neutralized, but the ripples of his financial crimes were already surging outward, preparing to crash against the fragile illusion of my family. 80 miles away in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, the morning sun illuminated the manicured lawns of my parents' colonial estate. Richard sat in his formal dining room, wearing a silk robe sipping premium imported coffee. He believed his legacy was secure. He believed the $10 million he wired yesterday had successfully purchased the floating shares necessary to oust me from my own company. His delusion shattered the moment a bonded courier rang the front doorbell. The delivery driver bypassed the estate staff, insisting on a direct signature from the homeowner. Richard signed the digital pad and accepted a thick, heavy envelope bearing the official seal of his primary wealth management institution. Richard carried the envelope back to the dining room, tearing open the reinforced paper. He expected a routine transaction receipt confirming the stock purchase. Instead, his eyes scanned a certified legal notice printed on harsh white paper. The text informed him that his generational trust fund was no longer active. The bank detailed the sudden intervention by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The $10 million had been flagged for suspected international money laundering and seized under the authority of the Patriot Act. The funds were locked in a federal holding pattern, pending a criminal investigation into illicit offshore routing. The blood drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The wealth that insulated him from the struggles of the real world evaporated in a single paragraph. His country club memberships, his property taxes, his luxury vehicle leases, and his daily living expenses were suddenly unfunded. He was legally bankrupted by a keystroke. A rational man would read the federal notice and recognize the deception of the son-in-law who orchestrated the transfer. Richard was not a rational man. He was a creature of toxic pride and unchecked entitlement. He refused to accept that he had been conned by Julian. His fragile ego required a scapegoat, and he defaulted to the target he had marginalized his entire life. Richard did not call to schedule an appointment. He dressed in his sharpest tailored suit, attempting to wear his former authority like armor, and drove straight to Manhattan. He utilized his residual high society arrogance to bully his way past the lobby security desk at the Aura Global headquarters. He rode the executive elevator to the top floor, his face flushed with mounting rage. The glass doors to my office swung open with a violent shove. Richard stormed into the room, his chest heaving, his hands balled into tight fists. He did not ask what happened to Julian or inquire about the federal investigation. He slammed the certified bank letter onto my desk, demanding immediate obedience. He ordered me to deploy the Aura corporate legal team to dispute the federal seizure. He expected the daughter he abandoned to act as his personal financial shield. Richard yelled that I possessed the capital and the Wall Street influence to unfreeze his trust fund. He demanded I write him a check from the company reserve accounts to float his lifestyle until the bank released his money. He framed the situation not as a consequence of his own greed, but as a temporary inconvenience that I was obligated to fix. I remained seated in my leather chair, resting my hands on the cool glass surface of my desk. I looked at the flushed, furious man standing before me and felt ice pumping through my veins. "You seem to misunderstand the dynamic of this room, Richard," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. You wired $10 million to an unregistered shell company in the Cayman Islands. You attempted to fund a federal fugitive. I do not rescue criminals, and I do not subsidize the people who fund them." His face contorted in disbelief. He pounded his fist against the desk, shouting that we were family. He weaponized the concept of blood loyalty, demanding respect and financial salvation. I picked up my pen, turning it slowly in my fingers. I let his shouting fade into the background before I delivered my response. 10 years ago, I stood in a cramped bank office in downtown Boston. I recounted my words, striking the air with surgical precision. Chloe needed $50,000 for a luxury vacation she called a study abroad program. You had the cash, but you refused to touch your travel fund. Instead, you shoved a pen into my hand and forced me to co-sign a predatory loan binding my future to her reckless debt. Richard shifted his weight, his eyes darting away for a fraction of a second as the memory surfaced. "I warned you about the interest rates." I continued, my gaze locked onto his. "I asked for your help. Do you remember what you told me while you packed your bags for the Swiss Alps? You told me to stop being selfish. You told me to sign the paper and figure it out yourself." I dropped the pen onto the desk. It landed with a sharp, definitive click. "I am not writing you a check," I stated. "Your trust fund is gone. Figure it out yourself." The rejection struck him like a physical blow. The realization that I was immune to his manipulation mutated his desperation into sheer, unadulterated fury. Richard pointed a trembling finger at my face, his tailored suit wrinkling as he leaned over the desk. "You think you hold all the cards because you bought a hotel chain." He spat, his voice trembling with venom. "You forget who taught you how to play the game? The trust fund was liquid cash, but it is not my only asset. I still own a portfolio of premium commercial real estate in this city." He stepped back, puffing his chest out, clinging to the last remnants of his financial leverage. "I will leverage every single square foot of those properties by tomorrow morning," Richard threatened. "I will secure a massive line of credit, and I will hire the most ruthless litigation firm on Wall Street. I will drag you and this brand through a decade of lawsuits. I will tie up your operations in endless discovery hearings until you beg me to settle. I will burn your empire to the ground before I let you disrespect me." He stood tall, believing his commercial real estate portfolio provided an impenetrable safety net. He thought his threat was a lethal checkmate. The side door connecting my office to the executive corridor opened. Marcus, my chief financial officer, stepped into the room. He wore an immaculate charcoal suit and moved with the quiet grace of a man who dealt exclusively in undeniable mathematics. Marcus carried a thickly heavy legal file under his arm. He bypassed Richard without offering a glance and stopped at the corner of my desk. "Commercial lending relies on a very delicate ecosystem." Richard Marcus explained, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "Traditional banks despise volatility. They abhor federal scrutiny. When the Treasury Department flags a high-net-worth client for suspected international money laundering, the banks do not wait around for a court verdict. They panic." Marcus opened the thick legal file, extracting a stack of documents printed on dense legal paper. He slid the stack across the glass desk toward my father. "When your generational trust was frozen this morning, the algorithms at your commercial lending institution triggered an automatic risk assessment." Marcus continued delivering the financial autopsy. "The bank instantly categorized all of your associated mortgages, your property lines of credit, and your real estate collateral as toxic debt. They needed to purge your liability from their balance sheets before the market closed today." Richard looked down at the documents, his bravado faltering. He saw the official letterheads of his commercial lenders. He saw the bold red stamps indicating asset transfer. "The bank packaged your commercial real estate debt and sold it off on the secondary market at a steep discount," Marcus stated, folding his hands in front of him. "A private shadow equity firm purchased the entire portfolio an hour ago." Richard let out a harsh, breathless laugh, trying to dismiss the revelation. "It does not matter who bought the paper," he fired back, gripping the edge of the desk. "The terms of the mortgages remain intact. As long as I make the monthly payments, the new firm cannot touch my properties. I will still leverage the equity to sue her." Marcus shook his head, projecting a deep, chilling pity. You did not read the fine print of your original loan agreements. Richard. Every commercial mortgage contains a criminal activity acceleration clause. Because your primary assets were seized under the Patriot Act, the new debt holder has the legal right to bypass the payment schedule and demand the entire principal balance immediately. Richard froze. His eyes darted between Marcus and the legal documents. He realized he was trapped in a financial vice, but he still did not understand who was turning the handle. The firm that purchased your debt is called Vanguard Equity, I announced, breaking the silence. Richard looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Vanguard Equity is a private holding company, I explained, keeping my tone razor sharp. I established it 3 years ago to acquire distressed assets. I am the sole proprietor. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The color drained from Richard's face a second time. The veins in his neck pulsed as the staggering reality of his situation crushed the remaining air from his lungs. Your lenders panicked and sold your debt to me, I stated, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the glass. The real estate you just threatened to leverage no longer belongs to your bankers. I own the paper. I own the commercial properties. I own the colonial estate in Connecticut. I picked up the top document from the stack and pushed it directly into his hands. It was a formal notice of accelerated collection. I am your sole creditor, Richard. I declared, the finality of the statement ringing through the quiet office. And I am foreclosing on your entire estate immediately. Richard stood paralyzed, clutching the foreclosure notice. The man who had walked into my office, demanding a bailout and threatening to destroy my empire, now realized he did not even own the roof over his head. The ultimate poetic justice was executed without a single raised voice, simply by utilizing the ruthless mechanics of the financial world he worshipped. I watched my father crumble under the weight of his own hubris, completely unaware that the destruction of his legacy was only the preamble to the nightmare about to engulf my sister. Richard stood paralyzed, clutching the foreclosure notice in his trembling hands. The man who had stormed into my office, demanding a bailout and threatening to destroy my empire, now realized he did not even own the roof over his head. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. He stared blankly at the glass surface of my desk, his mind unable to process the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin. The heavy silence in the executive suite was thick with the suffocating weight of his defeated pride. That silence was abruptly shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer stilettos echoing down the polished marble corridor. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open a second time. Chloe marched into the room. She wore a pristine, white-tailored blazer and oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her immaculate blonde hair. She held her smartphone gripped tightly in her hand, like a weapon ready to record and broadcast any perceived slight to her millions of followers. She radiated a toxic, frantic energy, driven entirely by vanity and aesthetic obsession. She bypassed Richard without a single glance. She did not notice the sickly pale shade of his skin or the way his shoulders slumped in profound defeat. She did not care that her father was currently hyperventilating over a legal document that stripped away his entire life savings. Her singular focus was the preservation of her own manufactured reality. Chloe slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the edge of my glass desk. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with untamed entitlement. She ordered me to stop this ridiculous corporate vendetta immediately. My wedding planner just called me in tears. Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the soundproof windows. The primary deposit for the private cathedral was revoked. The vendor supplying the imported white orchids suspended our account. The Michelin star catering team is threatening to pull out because their retainer check bounced this morning. You are ruining the most important week of my life. She slammed her hand against the desk, demanding immediate obedience. She ordered me to unlock the family trust fund. She expected me to utilize my authority as chairman to override the banking freezes and funnel the necessary capital to her wedding vendors. She viewed the federal investigation into her groom as nothing more than a petty inconvenience orchestrated by a jealous sibling. I looked at her pristine white blazer and her flawless makeup. I felt no pity. I only felt a cold, clinical detachment. The trust fund does not exist anymore. Chloe, I stated, keeping my tone flat and unyielding. The money is gone. Julian routed the entire balance into an unregistered shell company located in the Cayman Islands. He attempted to fund his escape from a federal indictment. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network flagged the transfer and seized the capital. Your wedding vendors are not getting paid because the United States Treasury currently holds the money as evidence of international wire fraud. Chloe blinked, processing the information. A normal person would recoil in horror upon learning their fiancé had stolen their family fortune to flee the country. A rational woman would cancel the catering and seek legal counsel. Chloe was neither normal nor rational. She took a step back and crossed her arms over her chest. The frantic panic regarding her floral arrangements vanished. Her lips curled upward, forming a smug, practiced smile. She pivoted her strategy, relying on the delusion of her own digital celebrity. Keep the trust fund, Chloe scoffed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. Let the federal agents keep the offshore accounts. Julian will sort out his own legal issues with his defense team. I do not need his money, and I certainly do not need your corporate charity to fund my lifestyle. She paced a short line across the hardwood floor, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance. I am a certified brand. Chloe boasted, her voice dripping with condescension. I generate my own revenue streams. I have exclusive endorsement contracts with 3 global cosmetics lines. I have a monetized lifestyle channel that pulls in 7 figures a year. My primary checking accounts are overflowing with corporate sponsorship payouts. I will just wire the funds to the wedding planner myself. She stopped pacing and turned to face me, placing her hands on her hips. She looked down at me with an expression of supreme triumph. You thought you could ruin me by targeting Julian, she sneered. You forgot one crucial legal detail, Claire. The high society wedding ceremony is scheduled for this weekend. On paper, I am just a fiancé. I am legally single. The Internal Revenue Service cannot touch my separate property or my independent income. I am insulated from his corporate drama. You lose. She smiled, waiting for me to concede defeat. She truly believed her influencer metrics and her brand deals provided an impenetrable shield against federal law. She thought she had outsmarted the system. I did not argue with her legal theory. I did not raise my voice to point out the flaws in her logic. I simply looked past her shoulder toward the side door, connecting my office to the executive corridor. The heavy wooden door clicked open. Julian, corporate litigator, stepped into the room. It was the same high-priced lawyer in the sharp pinstripe suit who had strutted into the boardroom earlier that morning. He no longer projected the arrogant swagger of a Wall Street shark. His tie was loosened, his forehead was slick with sweat, and he clutched his leather briefcase tightly against his chest. He had realized the undeniable danger of standing beside Julian. Presenting a forged severance contract to a corporate board constituted a severe federal crime. He was desperate to avoid a co-conspiracy charge. A cornered lawyer will always trade his client to secure his own immunity. Flanking the litigator was the lead inspector from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The federal agent wore a sharp gray suit and carried a thick, digital tablet. The litigator bypassed Chloe, avoiding her gaze entirely. He walked directly to my desk and unlatched his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single certified document printed on thick official state paper. His hands trembled slightly as he handed the document to the IRS inspector. I believe this establishes a clear material connection, the litigator murmured, his voice raspy and breathless. I am providing this record in exchange for formal prosecutorial immunity regarding the Boardroom incident. The inspector accepted the document. She scanned the text, her expression remaining cold and bureaucratic. She stepped forward and placed the certified paper flat on my glass desk directly in front of Chloe. I suggest you read the fine print of your own life, Chloe, I said, gesturing toward the document. Chloe frowned, her smug smile faltering. She leaned over the desk, looking at the bold black lettering stamped across the top of the page. It was a certificate of marriage. It bore the official embossed seal of the state of New York. The signature line contained Julian, neat executive script right next to Chloe, flamboyant looping autograph. The document was dated, notarized, and legally filed exactly 7 days ago. Julian understood the mechanics of offshore tax evasion better than anyone I explained, watching the realization dawn on my sister's face. He needed your signature to establish the shell company in the Cayman Islands. But setting up a dual director entity with an unmarried partner triggers a dozen red flags in the federal banking algorithms. He needed spousal privilege to expedite the tax loopholes. I leaned back in my leather chair, lacing my fingers together. He convinced you to do a secret courthouse elopement before the big public ceremony. I stated, piecing the timeline together for the room. He sold you a story about exclusive investment benefits and tax write-offs for your influencer brand. He told you it was a brilliant financial hack. And you signed the legal register because you never read the paperwork. You just sign your name and get what you want. Chloe stood frozen, staring at her own signature. The color drained from her cheeks, mirroring the exact pale shade of our father standing just a few feet away. The IRS inspector stepped closer to the desk, picking up the marriage certificate. She looked at Chloe with the clinical detachment of a predator, analyzing caught prey. The federal government does not recognize the concept of a high society ceremony, the inspector stated, her voice echoing with lethal authority. We only recognize the binding legal register. You are not a single woman. You are not a naive fiancé. You are officially and legally married to a man currently under federal indictment for international wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Chloe shook her head, her breathing turning shallow. That does not matter, she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the document. My cosmetic contracts are in my name. My bank accounts are separate. He does not have access to my brand revenue. Ignorance of the law does not grant you immunity, the inspector replied, tapping her digital tablet. Under the statutory guidelines of this jurisdiction, the moment you signed that marriage certificate, your separate independent revenue streams merged into a single financial entity. The inspector delivered the final crushing blow with surgical precision. Your cosmetic sponsorships, your lifestyle brand payouts, and your primary checking accounts are now legally classified as community property, the agent explained. Because your legal spouse utilized illicit offshore routing to hide stolen corporate capital, every single dollar attached to your marital identity is considered commingled funds. The money is toxic. Chloe let out a soft, choked gasp, taking a step backward. Her pristine designer blazer suddenly looked like a prison uniform. 10 minutes ago, a federal judge authorized a blanket civil asset forfeiture, warrant the inspector concluded, tapping the screen of her tablet to finalize the command. The Internal Revenue Service has just placed a hard freeze on your social media monetization channels, your corporate sponsorships, and your personal bank accounts. Your assets are currently subject to immediate government seizure. The smug, arrogant smile that Chloe had weaponized her entire life shattered into dust. The influencer who bragged about her limitless credit cards and her untouchable wealth realized she was standing in a high-rise office with zero liquid capital. Her extravagant wedding was dead. Her digital empire was seized. She was legally chained to a federal criminal, and her entire pristine reality was collapsing around her. The heavy silence in the executive suite was broken by the dull thud of imported leather hitting the hardwood floor. Chloe released her grip on her designer handbag. The exclusive accessory slipped from her fingers, tumbling onto the polished planks as the staggering reality of the federal asset freeze washed over her. The smug superiority that had defined her posture just moments ago evaporated. She stared at the marriage certificate, resting on my glass desk, her eyes wide and frantic. The influencer who curated every single second of her digital existence realized she had just lost control of the narrative. Her independent wealth, her lucrative brand endorsements, and her untraceable lifestyle were tethered to a man who is currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle. Survival instinct is a fascinating mechanism. When cornered by undeniable facts, a narcissist will invariably pivot to playing the victim. Chloe did not pause to process the gravity of Julian being a corporate spy. She did not express a single ounce of concern for the man she was supposed to marry this weekend. She only cared about the preservation of her own pristine image. Chloe raised her hands to her face, burying her features in her palms. When she lowered her hands, a calculated stream of tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her immaculate makeup. She let out a ragged sob, projecting the image of a heartbroken, naive bride whose entire world had just been shattered by a cruel predator. "He tricked me," Chloe wept, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Julian lied to me, Claire. He told me the courthouse paperwork was just a standard preliminary filing to secure our future estate. He said it was a necessary step for the wedding insurance. I never read the fine print. You know, I never read those boring legal documents." He put a pen in my hand and I trusted him. I had no idea he was stealing money from the company or hiding capital overseas. She took a step toward my desk, her tear-stained face pleading for salvation. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, cloying sweetness she always used when she needed someone to fix her mistakes. "You have to help me, Claire," she begged, her voice cracking. "You are the chairman of Aura Hospitality now. You have an entire division of the most ruthless corporate litigators on Wall Street working for you. Deploy your lawyers. Tell them to file an emergency annulment right this second. They can prove I signed that certificate under false pretenses. They can erase this marriage from the public record before the financial press gets a hold of the story." She leaned closer, placing her manicured hands on the edge of the glass desk. Her eyes darted frantically between me and the silent federal agent standing nearby. "If my sponsors find out I am legally married to a federal criminal, my career is over," Chloe pleaded, outlining the true source of her panic. "The cosmetic brands will invoke the morality clauses in my contracts and drop me instantly. My lifestyle channel will be demonetized. My entire digital brand will burn to the ground. You cannot let him drag me down with him. I am a victim here. Please just sign the authorization and let your legal team fix this nightmare." I sat in my leather chair, observing her performance with profound detachment. My father, Richard, stood motionless near the corner of the room, watching his golden child weep. He had spent his entire life indulging her vanity, shielding her from consequences, and funding her delusions. Now he watched her beg the daughter he had discarded for a legal bailout. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not reach out to hold her hand. I simply looked at her tear-streaked face and allowed the silence to stretch. "The ultimate flaw in your strategy. Chloe is assuming everyone else is as gullible as the people who follow you on the internet," I stated, keeping my voice low and razor-sharp. "You have spent your entire life playing the role of the beautiful, oblivious princess. It worked on our parents. It worked on your sponsors. But it does not work in a room governed by forensic accounting." I reached out and opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk. The smooth glide of the metal tracks sounded unusually loud in the quiet room. I extracted a heavy manila folder sealed with a red wax corporate stamp. I placed the folder on the glass surface, right next to the fraudulent marriage certificate. I opened the cover and extracted a thick stack of incorporation papers printed on dense legal parchment. I turned the documents around and pushed them across the desk until they rested directly beneath her trembling hands. "You claim Julian tricked you into a blind signature," I said, tracing the air over the documents. "You claim you had zero knowledge of his financial crimes or his offshore tax evasion. You want this room to believe you are just a naive influencer who cares about floral arrangements and brand deals." I tapped the bottom of the top page. "Take a very close look at the founding charter for the Cayman Islands Shell Company," I instructed, my tone echoing with lethal authority. Chloe lowered her gaze, looking at the heavy parchment. The color that had briefly returned to her cheeks vanished once again, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent white. The document detailed the establishment of the unregistered offshore entity. It outlined the corporate structure, the routing nodes, and the primary beneficiaries. At the very bottom of the page, resting clearly on the designated signature line, was her name. It was not a rushed, careless scrawl. It was her unmistakable, flamboyant signature, complete with the distinctive stylized loop she used to sign promotional posters for her cosmetic campaigns. "I did not just inherit a hotel chain this week, Chloe," I explained, delivering the truth with surgical precision. "I acquired a global security apparatus. When my intelligence team traced Julian routing numbers to the Caribbean, they did not just stop at the firewall. They breached the registry. They pulled the incorporation charter." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass, staring directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "You are not a victim," I stated, stripping away the final layer of her manufactured reality. "And you are certainly not naive. 6 months ago, your lifestyle channel hit a major subscription milestone. Your cosmetic endorsement contracts doubled. That sudden influx of revenue pushed your personal income into the highest federal tax bracket. You realized you were going to owe the government a staggering amount of money. You hated the idea of paying your fair share. You wanted to keep every single cent to fund your lavish aesthetic." Chloe shook her head, a slow mechanical movement, attempting to deny the undeniable evidence resting on the desk. "Julian did not trick you into signing anything," I continued, dismantling her lies piece by piece. "He offered you a solution. He proposed a ghost entity in a tax haven to wash your endorsement money. You eagerly agreed. You sat in a room with him, reviewed the offshore charter, and willingly signed your name as the official co-director of that Cayman shell company." I pointed to the secondary financial ledgers attached to the charter. "You also knew that setting up an offshore account required substantial seed capital to secure premium banking status." I explained, outlining the exact mechanics of their shared fraud. "You knew Julian was hiding $8 million from the Aura development ledgers. You let him funnel that stolen corporate capital into your shared shell company to inflate the balance and unlock the platinum tier benefits. You knowingly utilized embezzled funds to build a tax evasion fortress for your influencer brand." The executive suite fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Richard let out a low, agonizing groan, leaning heavily against the wall as he realized his favorite daughter was a willing accomplice in a massive federal crime. Chloe stood frozen, staring at her stylized signature. The tears dried up. The performance was over. She had walked into the room demanding a legal bailout and found herself staring at a concrete confession. The female inspector from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division stepped forward. She moved with quiet, unhurried efficiency. She reached to the back of her belt and unclasped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the chain echoed through the pristine office. Chloe stepped back, raising her hands defensively. "No," she whispered, her voice devoid of any strength. "No, you cannot do this. I have a brand. I have an audience." The federal agent did not flinch. She grabbed Chloe's right wrist, twisting it firmly behind the pristine white designer blazer. The steel cuff ratcheted tight, biting into the skin. "Ignorance of corporate structure is not a viable defense in a court of law," the inspector stated, her voice flat and uncompromising. "But given the forensic evidence resting on this desk, we are well past the illusion of ignorance. You are a documented signatory on a fraudulent offshore entity." The agent grabbed Chloe, left arm pulling it back to meet the right. The second cuff clicked into place, locking her wrists together. "Chloe, you are officially under federal arrest," the inspector declared, reciting the fatal charges with bureaucratic finality. "You are being charged with felony tax evasion and active conspiracy to commit international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The influencer who built an entire empire on curated perfection and unearned privilege was rendered entirely powerless. The pristine white blazer was wrinkled. Her designer handbag lay forgotten on the floor. Her lucrative brand deals were dead, and her digital audience was about to watch her downfall on the evening news. The federal agent steered the ruined bride toward the heavy glass doors, preparing to escort her out of the building. The toxic family dynamic that had marginalized me for decades was thoroughly crushed beneath the weight of financial law. But as the inspector guided Chloe into the corridor, the private secure phone line on my desk began to flash with a harsh, urgent red light. The corporate espionage Julian had initiated was far from contained. He had handed my enemy a loaded weapon, and the CEO of Apex Group was about to retaliate, utilizing the chaos of these arrests to launch a devastating strike against my newly acquired throne. The swift gears of the federal justice system do not pause for tears or ruined mascara. Within hours of her arrest, Chloe was processed through the intake center of a downtown Manhattan detention facility. The pristine white designer blazer she wore in my office was confiscated and replaced with a rigid canvas uniform. She was stripped of her expensive jewelry, her customized smartphone, and her manufactured dignity. She sat on a cold steel bench inside a concrete holding cell, staring at the reinforced glass. For the first time in her life, she was entirely isolated from the digital audience that validated her existence. While she shivered in the damp air of the federal building, her digital empire evaporated. The news of her arrest and her marriage to a corporate spy leaked to the financial press and the celebrity gossip network simultaneously. The fallout was instantaneous and unforgiving. The luxury cosmetic brands that once paid her hundreds of thousands of dollars to hold their products invoked the morality clauses hidden deep within her contracts. Her lucrative endorsement deals were severed via automated email notifications. Her social media channels, which usually hosted curated images of floral arrangements and exclusive resort vacations, transformed into a chaotic arena of public mockery. Millions of followers turned into a digital mob, dissecting her downfall with clinical precision. Her carefully constructed brand died in a matter of hours. Yet the most devastating blow did not come from the internet or the federal prosecutors. It came from the man she had planned to marry. 2 federal agents unlocked the heavy steel door of her holding cell. They did not bring her a catered meal or a sympathetic ear. The lead inspector carried a thick manila folder holding the preliminary interrogation transcripts from the adjacent facility where Julian was being held. The agents placed the open folder on the small metal table bolted to the floor. They instructed Chloe to read the highlighted paragraphs. Julian sat in a sterile interrogation room, facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary. Desperation strips a man of his loyalty, and a cornered corporate spy will always seek a scapegoat to shave years off his sentence. Julian did not accept responsibility for the offshore tax evasion. He turned his sights directly onto his new bride. The transcripts revealed a masterclass in calculated betrayal. Julian spun a fabricated narrative, painting himself as a victim of a greedy, ambitious socialite. He told the federal agents that Chloe orchestrated the entire Cayman Islands operation. He claimed she utilized her immense digital influence and her relentless demand for luxury goods to pressure him into hiding the $8 million. He pointed directly to the founding charter, highlighting her flamboyant signature. He argued that since she was the official co-director of the shell company, she was the primary architect of the money laundering scheme. Julian offered to testify against her in open court in exchange for prosecutorial leniency. Chloe read the typed words on the page. The illusion of her high society romance fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. She realized Julian never loved her. He viewed her as a convenient shield, a digital decoy designed to absorb the federal impact of his own corporate crimes. She was the designated scapegoat, facing 20 years in a federal prison while her groom attempted to bargain his way out. The sheer weight of the betrayal crushed the remaining oxygen from her lungs. 24 hours later, I walked into the visitor center of the detention facility. The room smelled of industrial bleach and stale fear. I sat down in a plastic chair facing a thick wall of reinforced acrylic glass. Chloe was escorted into the booth on the opposite side. Her blonde hair hung in greasy, tangled strands. Her skin was pale and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she picked up the black plastic receiver. I picked up my receiver and waited for her to speak. There was no arrogance left in her posture. The influencer who had shrieked demands and threatened my reputation was gone. Chloe pressed her forehead against the thick glass and wept. She begged for mercy. She described the terrifying reality of the concrete cell, the relentless noise of the prison block, and the horrific prospect of spending the best decades of her life locked inside a cage. She pleaded with me to deploy the elite legal division of Aura Hospitality to save her. She promised she would disappear. She would never ask for another designer item, and she would spend the rest of her life making amends if I just pulled her out of the nightmare. I observed her raw terror with a calm, unyielding gaze. I did not pity her, but I understood the strategic value of owning your enemies rather than simply destroying them. I slid a thick, leather-bound legal portfolio through the narrow steel transaction slot situated beneath the acrylic glass. I told Chloe that the corporate lawyers at Aura Hospitality were the finest legal minds on Wall Street. I explained that my legal team had already drafted a comprehensive non-custodial plea agreement with the federal prosecutors. We could leverage our corporate influence to dismantle Julian, fabricated testimony, and secure a probation sentence for her tax evasion charges. Furthermore, I offered to pay the staggering civil penalties levied by the Internal Revenue Service out of my own private accounts, keeping her out of a federal penitentiary. Chloe gasped, clutching the heavy portfolio to her chest like a physical lifeline. She thanked me profusely, her tears dripping onto the canvas uniform. She assumed she was receiving a sisterly bailout. She thought she was going back to a comfortable life. I raised a hand, silencing her gratitude. I informed her that the bailout was not a gift. It was a strict transaction forged in iron and bound by undeniable legal debt. The Internal Revenue Service fines totaled millions of dollars. Since her assets were seized and her earning potential was destroyed, she possessed zero liquid capital to repay me. I instructed her to open the portfolio and read the final document. It was a binding 10-year employment contract. I explained the terms of her salvation. In exchange for keeping her out of a federal prison cell, Chloe would sign a decade-long labor agreement with Aura Hospitality. Her wages would be garnished to repay the tax penalties and the elite legal fees. She would not work in the executive offices. She would not manage brand relations or social media accounts. I assigned her to the Housekeeping division. I told her she would be stationed at the exact Manhattan flagship hotel where she hosted her lavish engagement party. She would wear a standard-issue gray uniform. She would report for duty at 4 in the morning. She would spend the next 10 years of her life scrubbing porcelain toilets, changing stained bed linens, and pushing a heavy cleaning cart down the corridors for minimum wage. She would serve the exact same high society elites she used to mock. She would have zero access to her former luxury lifestyle. Chloe stared at the labor contract, her eyes widening in profound horror. The poetic justice of the arrangement was inescapable. She was being offered her freedom, but the cost was an eternity of manual labor inside the very empire she tried to steal. She looked at the signature line. She knew she had no alternatives. If she refused, she would return to the concrete cell for 20 years. With a shaking hand, she picked up the pen provided by the guards. She signed her flamboyant looping signature at the bottom of the page, legally sealing her own indentured servitude. She surrendered her pride, her brand, and her future, transferring ownership of her life directly to me. I collected the signed contract from the transaction slot. I stood up, leaving her weeping in the visitor booth. The toxic parasite that had drained my family was permanently neutralized and harnessed. I walked out of the detention facility and stepped into the bright Manhattan afternoon. The victory was absolute, but the financial world does not allow you to rest. As I reached my waiting town car, the encrypted phone in my pocket began to vibrate with intense urgency. The blinking red light I had noticed back in my office was now accompanied by a frantic alert from my chief financial officer. Julian had left a ticking time bomb inside the industry. By infecting the Apex Group servers with ransomware, he had driven their ruthless chief executive officer into a state of sheer, unhinged desperation. To secure the decryption keys and save his burning global network, the Apex executive had liquidated his shadow assets and launched a relentless, hostile takeover of Aura Hospitality. The media panic surrounding Julian's arrest provided the perfect smokescreen. Apex was currently buying up millions of floating shares, intending to strip away my chairman title before the trading day ended. The family dispute was settled, but the corporate war had just breached my front door. The quiet hum of the luxury town car provided a stark contrast to the financial carnage unfolding on the encrypted tablet resting in my lap. I sat in the back seat, watching the digital stock ticker bleed a harsh crimson across the screen. The financial press operates with predatory speed. The moment federal agents escorted Julian out of my executive suite, the news leaked to Wall Street. A former vice president of Aura Hospitality being hauled into a detention facility on charges of international wire fraud and corporate espionage was the perfect catalyst for a market panic. Cable news anchors dissected the scandal. Financial pundits speculated about systemic corruption within my newly acquired empire. The resulting fear triggered an algorithmic sell-off. Institutional investors and retail shareholders dumped their stock, creating a sudden flood of floating shares on the open market. My chief financial officer, Marcus, sat beside me, his eyes tracking a secondary data stream. He mapped the origin points of the massive buy orders, snapping up the discarded stock. The purchases were not random. They were highly coordinated. A network of anonymous proxy firms and offshore shadow entities were sweeping up every available share of Aura Hospitality at a steep discount. Marcus ran a rapid decryption sequence on the routing identifiers. The proxies traced back to a single overarching corporate umbrella. Apex Group was executing a hostile takeover. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was a testament to the ruthless survival instincts of the Apex chief executive. I had planted a military-grade ransomware payload in his centralized cloud infrastructure. His global network was currently paralyzed. His electronic hotel doors were locked shut. His payroll systems were frozen, and his internal communications were blacked out. The digital plague I engineered was starving his billion-dollar conglomerate to death, hour by hour. He could not hack the encryption, and he could not afford to wait for federal cyber units to clear the virus. He needed the master decryption key to save his legacy. Driven into a corner by his own blinding arrogance, he chose to launch a desperate counteroffensive. He liquidated his untraceable shadow assets, pulling dark money from private equity reserves to fund a blitzkrieg acquisition. He weaponized the media panic surrounding Julian to bypass standard regulatory waiting periods. He believed that if he could purchase the controlling interest in my company, he could put a gun to my head and force me to hand over the cure to his digital infection. The town car pulled up to the glass facade of the Aura Global headquarters. I stepped onto the pavement, the crisp Manhattan air doing nothing to dull the impending collision. I walked through the lobby, bypassing the anxious whispers of the corporate staff. The atmosphere on the executive floor was thick with mounting dread. Analysts ran down the corridors clutching frantic market reports. The corporate fortress I had just secured was under siege. I pushed open the heavy glass doors to the primary boardroom. The 12 original board members were already seated around the long mahogany table. They looked like casualties of a sudden shipwreck. Their faces were pale and their tailored suits felt inadequate against the crushing weight of the market data. A veteran venture capitalist at the far end of the table wiped a layer of cold sweat from his forehead, using a silk handkerchief. Another executive tapped his gold pen against the wood in a frantic, uneven rhythm. They had watched the Aura stock plummet, and they watched a known corporate raider devour their equity in real time. They were terrified. They lacked the stomach for a war of attrition. I took my seat at the head of the table. I did not offer them empty reassurances. I did not project a false sense of optimism. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood and waited. 10 minutes later, the security perimeter of the executive floor was breached. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were shoved inward with a deliberate, calculated force. The chief executive of Apex Group walked into my sanctuary. He did not ask for an invitation. He moved with the heavy, predatory stride of a man accustomed to taking whatever he desired. The pristine, billionaire aesthetic he usually projected was fraying at the edges. His custom Italian suit hung slightly loose over his frame, revealing the physical toll of his paralyzed empire. His eyes were bloodshot, mapping the sleepless nights spent watching his servers burn. Yet despite the visible exhaustion, he radiated a toxic, undeniable triumph. He did not come alone. A phalanx of high-priced corporate lawyers flanked him, entering the room in perfect synchronization. They wore identical dark gray suits and carried slim leather briefcases. They fanned out across the back wall of the boardroom, forming a physical barrier between the Aura executives and the exit. They transformed the corporate meeting space into a hostile containment zone. The apex executive bypassed the empty leather chairs and marched directly to the opposite end of the mahogany table. He stood directly across from me. He did not offer a handshake. He did not utter a polite corporate greeting. He raised his hands and slammed them down onto the polished wood. The sharp, echoing crack made 3 of the board members flinch in their seats. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, bound legal folio. He tossed it down the center of the table. The document slid across the smooth mahogany, coming to a halt just inches from my folded hands. The cover page bore the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission, denoting a finalized transfer of ownership. "The game is over," he declared, his voice a low, grating rasp that cut through the silence of the room. "The proxy acquisitions cleared 10 minutes ago." He leaned forward, resting his weight on his knuckles. He surveyed the terrified venture capitalists sitting along the sides of the table, his lips curling into a predatory sneer. "As of this exact moment, I own exactly 51% of the voting shares for Aura Hospitality," he announced, delivering the mathematical reality with crushing finality. "I hold the controlling interest. I dictate the future of this board. I own the flagship properties. I own the ground you are currently sitting on." The veteran venture capitalist dropped his gold pen. The metallic clatter amplified the profound sense of defeat, suffocating the room. The board members lowered their heads, believing the war was lost. They assumed the hostile takeover was a flawless execution of market dominance. The apex executive turned his bloodshot eyes back to me. He expected to see fear. He expected to see the panicked realization of a woman who had just lost her entire empire. "I require 2 things before I leave this building," he stated, outlining his terms of surrender. "First, you will draft a formal letter of resignation, stepping down as chairman of this board, effective immediately. You will relinquish all executive privileges and walk out of that lobby with nothing." He pointed a rigid finger at my face, the underlying desperation leaking into his authoritative tone. "Second, you will provide the master decryption keys to the localized algorithm currently infecting my server network," he commanded. "You will restore my cloud infrastructure and unlock my global properties." He stood tall, adjusting the lapels of his suit, attempting to project an impenetrable shield of corporate sovereignty. "If you refuse to sign the resignation or withhold the digital keys, I will exercise my majority shareholder rights," he threatened. "I will not just fire you. I will dissolve this entire board of directors without a single severance package. I will liquidate Aura Hospitality piece by piece. I will sell your flagship New York property to a residential condo developer. I will gut the Chicago hotel and sell the fixtures for scrap. I will terminate every single employee in your global network and erase this brand from the hospitality sector permanently. You will hand over the keys right now, or I will burn your legacy to the ground." The ultimatum hung in the cold air of the boardroom. The team of gray-suited lawyers stood motionless behind him, ready to draft the dissolution paperwork. The Aura board members held their collective breath, staring at me in desperate silence. They were waiting for me to concede. They believed the hostile takeover was an unbreakable iron cage. They did not understand that I never sat down at a table without knowing exactly who was dealing the cards. The ultimatum echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. The team of gray-suited lawyers stood motionless, ready to execute the corporate slaughter. My board of directors looked at me with hollow eyes, waiting for the white flag of surrender. They expected me to reach for the silver pen resting on the mahogany table and draft my resignation. They expected me to trade my empire for a digital key. I did not reach for the pen. I reached for the crystal carafe sitting in the center of the table. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The liquid splashed against the ice cubes, creating a crisp, sharp sound that cut through the heavy tension in the room. I took a slow, measured sip. I placed the glass down, ensuring the base rested silently on the polished wood. I looked up at the apex executive. His chest heaved slightly, his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. He was a man running on fumes and borrowed time. "You view a hostile takeover as a simple mathematical equation?" I said, keeping my voice conversational, devoid of any panic. "You assume that because you liquidated your shadow assets and unleashed a wave of proxy buyers, you automatically control the board. You think brute financial force is an uncrackable strategy?" The apex executive sneered, placing his hands on his hips. "The shares cleared," he spat, tapping the thick legal folio on the table. "The proxy firms executed the buy orders. The equity is mine. Sign the resignation and hand over the decryption keys before I lose my patience." I ignored his command. I reached over to the communication console embedded in the desk and pressed a single brass button. "Send our guest in," I instructed. The heavy glass doors at the back of the boardroom opened. The phalanx of apex lawyers shifted, creating a narrow path. A man walked into the room, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of old money and generational wealth. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his piercing blue eyes carried the weight of a seasoned titan. He leaned slightly on a polished wooden cane, but his posture projected unyielding authority. He was the original founder of Apex Group. 5 years ago, he built the hospitality conglomerate from a single boutique hotel into a global empire. And 5 years ago, the man currently standing across from me engineered a ruthless illegal boardroom coup to oust him, stealing his life work through fabricated scandals and forced buyouts. The apex executive turned his head, annoyed by the interruption. When he recognized the older man, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade. The predatory confidence evaporated instantly. "Hello, Victor," the founder said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "You look exhausted." Running a stolen company takes a significant toll on the nerves. "What is he doing here?" The apex executive demanded, his voice cracking as he looked back at me. "This is a closed board meeting. Security should have stopped him in the lobby." "He is here as a primary shareholder," I replied. "And he is here to watch you lose everything." I tapped the control panel. The lights dimmed and the high-definition projector descended from the ceiling. The screen illuminated, casting a stark glow over the frightened venture capitalists sitting around the table. I opened a secure terminal on my laptop. The screen displayed the harsh crimson background of the ransomware payload currently paralyzing the Apex servers. When Julian delivered my red flash drive to your golf club, you assumed it contained a simple locking script. I explained, typing a rapid sequence of commands. You assumed the digital contagion was designed merely to freeze your electronic doors and disable your payroll. You misunderstood the fundamental nature of modern cyber warfare. The crimson screen split down the middle. The right side of the display, populated with thousands of lines of raw encrypted code, scrolling at blinding speed. "A locking algorithm is a blunt instrument." I continued, leaning back in my leather chair. "I prefer tools with precision. The payload I engineered did not just encrypt your primary hard drives. Before it locked the doors, it mirrored the root directory. It acted as a subterranean siphon. While you were staring at the red screen, panicking over your frozen hotel registries, my secure servers were downloading every single confidential ledger you kept hidden in your cloud infrastructure." I pressed the Enter key. The scrolling code vanished, replaced by a series of pristine financial spreadsheets. The columns were highlighted in stark yellow and red ink, indicating illicit capital flows. The Apex lawyers turned to look at the screen. Their rigid posture broke. They were looking at the internal, unredacted accounting books of their own employer. The Apex executive gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. "You did not just steal this company from its founder," I stated, projecting the financial evidence for the entire room to witness. "You have spent the last 5 years embezzling from your own shadow investors. I found the ghost accounts in Cyprus. I traced the slush funds you routed through Malta. You took the capital provided by ruthless, lethal backers, and you skimmed off the top to fund your private jet, your luxury real estate, and your ego. The board members of Aura Hospitality sat in stunned silence watching the autopsy of a rival billionaire. When you launched this hostile takeover today, you utilized proxy firms to purchase the floating shares I recounted, mapping his strategy aloud. You deployed the remainder of your shadow capital to buy a controlling interest in my company. But proxy acquisitions require intermediaries. They require brokers who answer to the highest bidder. I stood up from my chair, walking slowly toward the center of the room. An hour ago, while you were marching toward my building, I contacted the shadow investors backing your firm. I revealed my voice, dropping to a lethal quiet register. I sent them a secure data packet containing these exact spreadsheets. I showed them the undeniable proof that you were stealing their money. The apex executive took a step backward, his polished shoes scraping against the floor. The realization of his tactical error crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. He knew his shadow investors did not utilize the civil court system to resolve financial disputes. He knew a stolen dollar equated to a death sentence. Those investors were not pleased to learn about your slush funds, I noted, offering a cold, razor-sharp smile. They decided to liquidate their association with you immediately. They did not authorize their proxy firms to sell the Aura voting shares to your portfolio. They instructed the brokers to route the equity through a blind trust. I picked up the thick, legal folio he had tossed onto my desk. I opened the cover, flipping to the signature page, outlining the final transfer of ownership. I purchased the blind trust 20 minutes ago, I announced, dropping the folio back onto the mahogany wood. You do not own 51% of this company. I do. Your hostile takeover was funded by your own enemies and executed for my benefit. You just spent the last of your stolen capital to secure my throne. The team of corporate lawyers did not hesitate. They read the shifting winds of power with predatory instinct. The lead attorney set his briefcase on the floor and took 3 deliberate steps away from the apex executive, severing his legal representation on the spot. The rest of the legal team followed suit, creating a physical void around the ruined billionaire. The apex executive looked around the room, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. He was bankrupt. He was exposed. And he was marked for death by the most dangerous financial syndicate in the world. He fell to his knees, his custom Italian suit crumpling against the hardwood floor. He looked up at me, his hands shaking. He realized the digital keys to the ransomware were useless now. The servers were empty. The money was gone. "Please," he whispered, his voice a ragged, pathetic rasp. "They will kill me. You have to give me a head start. Let me leave the building." I looked down at him, feeling the profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed checkmate. I did not need to raise my voice or engage in a shouting match to destroy him. I just needed to let his own unchecked greed consume him. "I am not a murderer," I replied, keeping my posture rigid. "I am actually going to save your life today." I pressed the brass button on the communication console a second time. The side doors connecting the boardroom to the executive corridor swung open. 4 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division stepped into the room. They wore dark tactical windbreakers and carried heavy steel handcuffs. They bypassed the silent lawyers and surrounded the kneeling executive. I handed a silver encrypted flash drive to the lead federal agent. This drive contains the unredacted ledgers detailing systemic corporate fraud, international embezzlement, and illicit wire transfers, I informed the agent. The FBI agent nodded, securing the drive in an evidence pouch. He reached down, grabbing the apex executive by the collar of his expensive suit, and hauled him to his feet. The metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs echoed through the silent boardroom, sealing the fate of the corporate raider. "The federal penitentiary is the safest place for you right now," I told the ruined billionaire as the agents dragged him toward the exit. "The concrete walls will protect you from your investors. You have decades to think about the difference between brute force and true strategy." The heavy glass doors closed behind the federal transport, leaving the boardroom in pristine silence. The original founder of Apex Group stepped forward, resting both hands on his polished wooden cane. He offered a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of corporate warfare. The hostile takeover was crushed. The enemy was eradicated. But the ultimate consolidation of power required one final maneuver to ensure my empire would never be challenged again. The dust settled in the wake of the federal raid, leaving the primary boardroom feeling lighter purged of the toxic ambition that had threatened to consume it. The heavy glass doors remained sealed, shutting out the chaos of the financial press and the frantic whispers of the corporate analysts. I stood before the combined executive boards of Aura Hospitality and Apex Group. The long mahogany table was now filled with seasoned directors who looked at me not as a young heiress, but as an undeniable apex predator of the financial sector. Victor, the original founder of the rival conglomerate, sat at my right hand serving as a silent testament to the restoration of order. The transition of power was absolute. I picked up a silver fountain pen and signed the Master Integration Charter. The nib scratched smoothly across the thick parchment, binding thousands of employees, hundreds of properties, and billions of dollars in revenue under a single corporate umbrella. With a single stroke of ink, I merged the two competing entities into an untouchable global monopoly. The room erupted into respectful, measured applause. There was no shouting and no chaotic celebrations. It was just the quiet, sophisticated hum of immense wealth being consolidated. The venture capitalists who had trembled in fear an hour ago now looked at me with profound reverence. I had orchestrated the largest corporate acquisition in the history of the hospitality industry, navigating a minefield of digital sabotage and hostile takeovers without firing a single weapon. The justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability when fed undeniable cryptographic evidence. Downtown at the federal courthouse, Julian and the ousted Apex chief executive faced the grim reality of their hubris. I sat in the back row of the gallery during their arraignment hearing, observing the stark transformation. The bespoke Italian suits and custom silk ties were gone, replaced by standard-issue canvas uniforms. The polished confidence that fueled their corporate espionage had dissolved into raw, trembling fear. The federal prosecutor laid out the charges, presenting the forged golden parachute, the offshore shell company charters, and the stolen server ledgers. The defense attorneys attempted to request bail, arguing their clients posed no danger to the public and possessed deep ties to the community. Julian looked over his shoulder, scanning the gallery with desperate, sunken eyes. He saw me sitting in the back row, wearing a tailored emerald suit, projecting the exact high society authority he had tried to strip from me. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words died in his throat. He finally understood the vast chasm between his manufactured intellect and my strategic execution. The presiding judge looked down from the elevated bench, flipping through the extensive, unredacted financial files I had provided to the authorities. The judge cited the uncollateralized Cayman wire transfers and the looming lethal threats from international shadow syndicates. The court determined both men possessed the means and the motivation to flee the jurisdiction. Bail was denied. The gavel fell with a heavy wooden crack, sealing their fate. Federal marshals guided the two ruined men out of the courtroom. They were remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, facing decades behind reinforced steel doors. Their brilliant educations and ruthless ambition were permanently reduced to federal inmate numbers. While the architects of the corporate war languished in concrete cells, the collateral damage swept through the Connecticut suburbs. The foreclosure on my parents' estate was executed with pristine bureaucratic indifference. I did not visit the property to gloat or deliver a final monologue. I simply let the Vanguard Equity Asset Managers handle the eviction protocol. A generic moving truck idled in the circular driveway of the sprawling colonial home. Richard and Beverly, stripped of their generational trust fund and drowning in accelerated commercial debt, were forced to pack their lives into cheap cardboard boxes. The antique porcelain vases, the imported silk rugs, and the vintage leather trunks they once packed for the Swiss Alps were seized and auctioned to cover their outstanding liabilities. They walked out of the manicured fortress that they had worshipped for 30 years, clutching a few remaining suitcases. The neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress peeked through their plantation shutters, watching the quiet, humiliating departure without offering a single word of sympathy. The reality of their new existence was a crushing claustrophobic nightmare. Richard and Beverly relocated to a cramped, drafty studio apartment situated above a failing dry cleaner on the neglected edge of the city. The smell of harsh industrial chemicals seeped through the floorboards, permeating their cheap thrift store clothing. The spacious climate-controlled silence of their former mansion was replaced by the relentless rattle of passing transit trains and the hum of flickering streetlights. Beverly, a woman who used to complain if her silk sheets were not pressed properly, now slept on a sagging mattress, listening to the sirens wailing in the distance. The peeling wallpaper and stained linoleum floors served as a daily reminder of their catastrophic fall from grace. Their social exile was profound and absolute. Beverly attempted to contact her country club associates, seeking a small loan or a temporary guest room. Every call went straight to voicemail. The elite circles of high society operate on a strict currency of pristine optics and perceived wealth. A bankrupted patriarch and a mother whose favorite daughter was arrested for international money laundering were toxic liabilities. They were ghosted by the very people they had sacrificed my childhood to appease. The daily mechanics of survival eroded their remaining pride. Richard, a man who once dined exclusively on Wagyu beef and imported caviar, now stood in the harsh, fluorescent aisles of a discount grocery store. He calculated the cost of canned goods, his hands shaking as he swiped a government assistance card at the checkout register. The cashier did not care about his former golf handicaps or his past commercial real estate portfolio. He was just another impoverished citizen, struggling to afford basic necessities. One rainy afternoon, Richard walked down the damp, cracked sidewalk, his frayed collar turned up against the biting wind. His worn shoes leaked water seeping into his socks. He paused at a corner newsstand, seeking a momentary distraction from the grim reality of his studio apartment. His eyes scanned the glossy magazine rack and froze. Staring back at him from the center display was the latest issue of Forbes. The cover featured a high-resolution portrait of me, standing in my glass executive suite, projecting quiet, immovable authority. The bold typography across the bottom read, "The architect of a billion-dollar monopoly." Richard stared at the magazine, the icy rain soaking through his thin coat. The agonizing sting of his own catastrophic misjudgment pierced his chest. He realized that in his blind, arrogant rush to protect a vain daughter and a fraudulent son-in-law, he had discarded the only person capable of securing his legacy. He threw away a diamond to protect a piece of shattered glass, and the resulting lacerations left him bleeding out in a forgotten corner of the city. He could not afford to purchase the magazine. He simply lowered his head and walked back to his dark, cramped apartment, carrying the unbearable weight of his own ruin. The ultimate payoff was delivered through the flawless architecture of the law and the unyielding mathematics of the financial market. I dismantled a toxic family dynamic and crushed a rival billionaire without shedding a single drop of blood. I weaponized their own greed, allowing their unchecked vanity to build the very cages that now held them captive. The corporate war was won, the enemies were vanquished, and the throne was secure. But a true victor never leaves a loose end unexamined. Before I could close the ledger on this dark chapter forever, there was one final debt that required my personal oversight, located in the housekeeping corridors of my flagship hotel. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell in the federal courthouse, sealing the fate of the corporate raiders. The turning of the seasons meant nothing inside the windowless corridors of the maximum security penitentiary. Julian woke up every morning at 5, under the harsh glare of a caged fluorescent bulb. He did not put on a bespoke Italian suit or knot an imported silk tie. He stepped into a stiff canvas jumpsuit, stamped with a faded black inmate number. The Ivy League prodigy who once commanded a global hospitality empire was now permanently assigned to the sanitation detail of the prison mess hall. His brilliant education, his mastery of offshore tax loopholes, and his predatory corporate strategies held zero currency behind reinforced concrete walls. He spent his days pushing a heavy industrial mop across the cracked linoleum floor. The air inside the cell block smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and harsh institutional bleach. The soft, manicured hands that once swirled expensive champagne in private golf clubs were now raw, calloused and cracked from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals. Julian served his sentence, surrounded by men who did not care about his former net worth or his Wall Street connections. Whenever a fellow inmate dropped a plastic tray of food, Julian was summoned to clean the spill. He would drop to his knees, scrubbing the sticky residue, while the rest of the cafeteria watched in apathetic silence. The corporate spy had sought to steal billions, and now his entire universe was reduced to the circumference of a wet mop. 300 miles away in the heart of Manhattan, justice took a different but equally poetic form. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the flagship property of Aura Hospitality. Inside the subterranean locker room of the luxury hotel, Chloe stood before a narrow metal locker. She did not reach for a custom silk gown or a pristine white designer blazer. She pulled a scratchy, drab gray housekeeping uniform from a wire hanger. The fabric was stiff, unyielding, and designed to blend into the background. The influencer who once curated every aesthetic detail of her life was now forced into a state of mandatory invisibility. Chloe secured her blonde hair into a tight, functional knot, pulling it away from her face. She walked into the service corridor and gripped the handle of a heavy plastic cleaning cart. The wheels rattled as she pushed it down the polished marble hallways, loaded with spray bottles, stiff, bristled brushes, and stacks of folded cotton towels. The physical labor was grueling. Her shoulders ached from making heavy, king-sized beds, and her knees throbbed from kneeling on bathroom tiles. She worked a mandatory 10-hour shift strictly monitored by a relentless floor manager who did not tolerate unauthorized breaks. Every dollar she earned, beyond the legal minimum, was automatically garnished, routed directly into the corporate accounts to pay down her towering federal tax debt. The profound shift in her reality was captured by a single piece of plastic hanging from a cheap lanyard around her neck. 6 months ago, at her lavish engagement party, Julian had draped his arm around her shoulder and handed her a sleek, heavy metal platinum black card. She had boasted to the elite guests that she never checked price tags and only signed her name. That symbol of limitless stolen wealth was gone. In its place rested a flimsy, scratched gray service card. The magnetic strip on the back held no purchasing power. It granted no executive privileges. The cheap plastic key only opened the doors to the subterranean service elevators and the windowless janitorial supply closets. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of her descent from the penthouse to the basement. The psychological toll of her indentured servitude was far heavier than the physical labor. Chloe was specifically assigned to clean the premium suites on the top floor. It was the exact same penthouse level where she had hosted her extravagant engagement party. The irony was not lost on the New York high society circuit. The digital mob that had celebrated her downfall on the internet quickly realized where she was serving her sentence. Her former influencer friends, the very women who used to covet her brand endorsements and mimic her style, began booking the luxury suites for weekend getaways. They did not visit the hotel to enjoy the spa or the fine dining. They booked the rooms specifically to hunt their fallen queen. Chloe would knock on the heavy oak doors, announcing housekeeping in a low, defeated voice. She would step into the suite, pushing her rattling cart to find her former peers lounging on the plush sofas. They would sip premium mimosas and watch her work. When Chloe dropped to her knees to scrub the porcelain rims of the toilets or polish the brass fixtures of the soaking tubs, the smartphones would appear. The sharp clicking sounds of camera shutters echoed through the bathroom. Her former friends recorded her humiliation, broadcasting the footage to millions of followers online. They offered fake, sympathetic smiles, asking if she missed her cosmetic sponsorships while she scrubbed their discarded makeup wipes from the marble counters. Chloe could not talk back. She could not throw down her sponge and storm out of the suite. She could not defend her dignity. The ironclad 10-year employment contract she signed in the detention facility contained strict behavioral clauses. If she acted unprofessionally, if she engaged in a verbal altercation with a paying guest, or if she abandoned her shift, she would violate the terms of her non-custodial plea agreement. The federal prosecutors would immediately revoke her probation and send her straight to a concrete cell. She was trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, forced to silently endure the relentless mockery of the elite society she once ruled. She wiped the brass fixtures, blinking back tears that nobody cared to see. I did not visit the prison to watch Julian scrub the mess hall floor. I did not ride the service elevator to watch my sister push her heavy cart down the corridor. True victors do not need to hover over the ruins of their enemies to validate their success. I stood on the sprawling terrace of my new global headquarters, occupying the highest floor of the tallest commercial skyscraper in the financial district. The evening air was crisp, carrying the low electric hum of the city below. I held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with a rare, aged scotch. The amber liquid caught the ambient light, glowing softly in the encroaching twilight. I walked to the edge of the glass balcony and looked down at the glittering expanse of the Manhattan skyline. The streets were arteries of light, pulsing with the endless flow of capital and ambition. From this vantage point, the luxury hotels, the commercial real estate portfolios, and the rival conglomerates looked like pieces on a sprawling geometric board. I controlled the board. Julian had stood under a crystal chandelier 6 months ago, pointing a finger at my plain, gray suit and calling me the failure of the family. He believed that power was measured by designer labels, expensive watches, and loud, arrogant boasts. My father believed power was a country club membership and a blind trust fund. My sister believed power was a digital metric calculated by likes and sponsorships. They were all fatally incorrect. True power is not loud. It does not require a bespoke tuxedo or a viral social media campaign. It does not demand constant validation from a room full of strangers. True power is cold, silent, and structural. It is the ability to rewrite the rules of engagement while your opponents are still arguing over the opening move. It is owning the invisible legal architecture that dictates the flow of wealth. The most satisfying vengeance is never delivered with a clenched fist or a shouted threat. Vengeance is absolute when you patiently acquire the very foundation your enemies are standing on and quietly remove the floorboards beneath their feet. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the aged scotch, savoring the complex, smoky finish as the city lights burned bright against the dark sky. If you love seeing arrogant villains destroyed by absolute corporate brilliance, hit like and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories.